I started going into questions. Where are you at? Tell me where you are. What's going on? Where were you shot? Then he stops for a minute, and then he says, I love you and the kids, and to take care of the kids. He stopped responding.
Because of the trauma from the gunshot, most likely his lungs were filling with blood. The body's trying very hard, it's working overdrive. The lawyer reached out to the police and volunteered his client.
He can tell them exactly who committed the crime.
He was actually a primary target, the guy they really would like to have shot. The bad guys, they don't care. It's revenge, retaliation, revenge, retaliation.
October 19th, 2012, Syracuse, New York. It's just after 8 p.m. on the city's north side.
The Syracuse Police Department received 3 911 calls for a shooting.
Officers rush to the location where they find 2 victims.
They found one victim on the ground, and then they also found another person that had a minor, very minor injury from a gunshot wound that grazed his back, his upper back.
The man on the ground is struggling to breathe. Officers attempt first aid.
They didn't see obvious injury to him at that point. So what they did is they cut his shirt off, and then they spotted a small amount of blood. He was shot once in the left side near his armpit. Because of the trauma from the gunshot, most likely his lungs were filling with blood. The body's trying very hard, it's working overdrive to get air in. Just a minute or two after that, our ambulance crew arrived and was able to provide advanced medical care.
EMTs rushed the man to the hospital. The second victim identifies himself as 20-year-old Shavoki Bloodworth.
He was looked at by ambulance personnel on the scene and declined further treatment.
Shavoki tells police he doesn't know the other victim. At the hospital, the man fighting for his life is soon identified as 30-year-old Walter Bell, a resident of South Carolina. Walter Bell III was born on July 12, 1982, in Orangeburg, South Carolina. At a young age, Walter's parents separated, and he went to live with his mother in New York.
Walter was born in South Carolina, but spent most of his childhood and growing up in Long Island.
There, Walter was part of a large community of family and friends that included 2 brothers, 4 younger sisters, and his childhood best friend, Latia.
Everybody was just carefree, just running around having a good time, causing destruction with the parents, running the parents crazy.
Walter took care of his siblings.
Walter was the protector. He felt like he had to protect his sisters. The sisters got boyfriends, and he had to interrogate them.
He's just so family oriented. He cares about people and he put others before himself.
In his teenage years, Walter's mom grew concerned that her son was headed down the wrong path.
Walter started getting into a little bit of the rougher lifestyle of Long Island, so his mom decided to send him back to South Carolina to live with his dad.
Orangeburg, South Carolina was a big change. But not too long after he moved, Walter welcomed a familiar face to town.
My family was gradually moving to South Carolina because there was land owned within the family. And so when we moved, I boo-hoo cried from New York to Virginia. And I was kind of relieved when I got closer to South Carolina because that phone rang and it was Walter calling me.
In South Carolina, Walter and Latia's lifelong friendship blossomed into a full-blown romance.
Walter was always there for her. She was always there for him. He was going to marry Tia.
Walter's home life was rocky. During their senior year of high school, Walter and Latia came to depend on each other like they never had before.
He had nowhere to stay. I had nowhere to stay due to, family issues. And we walked and walked and walked throughout the nights. We went up into a football field and slept in the announcer's box for weeks.
So it was like him and Tia, was pretty much just living on the street.
The young lovers were on their own. Walter's sister-in-law tried to help.
Santana would sneak food and covers and blankets and pillows and things out of the window for us at night. And nobody knew we was outside that window but her.
In 2003, more trouble caught up with Walter.
Walter got into some things that he should not have. He was accused of breaking into homes and stealing things.
21-year-old Walter was arrested and charged with second-degree burglary. He pled guilty and was sentenced to 15 years in prison.
I cried and I cried and I cried. And we were allowed to spend some time together afterwards, back by the holding cells. And Walter looked at me and said, the only thing I want you to do is live your life to whatever makes you happy. Just make sure that when I come home, I have a place to come home to.
When he was in prison, it was never a time that he didn't write, he didn't call, he always kept in contact, always.
There was a lot of ups and downs, a lot of me trying to find myself, a lot of me trying to rebuild myself back up.
In October 2010, after almost 7 years behind bars, Walter was granted parole. By then, Latia was a single mother to 3 young kids. Walter and Latia picked up where they left off.
When he came home, he loved her kids. He took all of her kids in, they was his kids.
When he started bonding with the kids is when it was just okay, well, it is what it is. We can't change it.
The childhood sweethearts settled into life together, with Walter taking on the role of stepdad. By the summer of 2012, they had plans to marry. But first, they needed a fresh start.
He was unable to find work because of his record. He was just trying and just staying focused and not going back on the prior ways that he was doing, the things he was doing before he went to jail. He was trying to make a way and work, actually work.
And then Walter hears about an opportunity back in New York.
Walter's cousin offered to help him get a job at a recycling center in Syracuse.
I said, well, I don't know. I really don't want to go back to New York. And he looked me in my eyes and he said, Tia, I'll ride with you no matter what. Whatever decisions you make, I ride with you on it. I want you to ride with me on this. That Friday, we packed up 3 laundry bags of clothes and shoes, packed the kids up, and got on the Greyhound.
The couple stayed with friends and in hotels until they could find a place of their own. Around the same time, Latia delivered news that there was more change to come.
I said, Walter, and I showed him the pregnancy test. He was like, are you serious? He was so happy. Within 5 minutes, he had done called his mom. He had done called his oldest sister. He called his god sister. He was just so happy.
He was so excited that he was about to be a dad. Nobody couldn't take that moment from him. That moment meant the world.
Just 6 weeks after arriving in Syracuse, Walter Bell is fighting for his life at a hospital following a life-threatening gunshot wound. Another man, Shavoki Bloodworth, was grazed by a bullet in the same attack. He is still on the scene.
He voluntarily gave part of his story as to what happened, as to how he saw the incident unfold.
Which isn't much.
Mr. Bloodworth was saying he didn't know the man, Mr. Bell in this case, and that he was just an innocent bystander, didn't know anything, just heard some gunshots and felt something hit his back.
Investigators search for evidence. They recover 2 .25 caliber shell casings.
The other thing you want to immediately do is start to canvass the area, especially for cameras. And then you want to find anybody that's close by that may have observed what happened. One of the people that called 911, her and her daughter got a good look at 2 males that walked past their house.
They described them as wearing dark clothing.
They saw 2 black men in their 20s approach the victim. A few minutes later, shots rung out.
And then they saw them go past back by their house, go back to a vehicle they described as a white SUV that then left the scene. They didn't see them with a gun. They didn't see them actually shoot anybody. They just saw them going to the crime scene and then leaving the crime scene.
Police put out an APB with the descriptions. Then, less than an hour after the initial 911 calls, detectives get an update on Walter's condition.
His bleeding was internal, so there wasn't much that they could do. Walter was pronounced dead at the Upstate University Hospital.
Now they have a homicide investigation on their hands.
In the late hours of October 19, 2012, police in Syracuse, New York are investigating a shooting when they learn that one of the victims, 30-year-old Walter Bell, did not survive. Detectives go to the hospital where doctors have recovered the bullet from Walter's body.
It was a small .25 caliber, consistent with the 2 shell casings that were found up the street.
Hospital staff tell detectives that the victim's fiancée, Latia Walker, is on the phone. She has just been informed of the shooting.
The detective asked me what my name was, where did I live, how soon could I get to the hospital. And I said to him, I don't even know I don't know where anything is. I've only been in town for 6 weeks. I would have to figure out how I'm getting there. And I told him I had my kids.
Detectives agreed to meet Latia at the hotel where she and Walter have been staying since arriving in town.
They showed up, they knocked on the door, and one of them asked me to step outside with him. The other one stayed inside with the kids. And he told me that Walter didn't make it. At that point, I lost all hope for everything. Everything.
Latia explains that earlier in the evening, she and Walter had been at the hotel when he received a phone call.
It was his cousin calling and saying, he wanted to spend some time with him and things of that nature. So Walter decided to go with him. Walter left the motel probably around 4:30, 5 o'clock. Anytime Walter goes anywhere, when he gets to where he's going, he always called me to let me know he made it to where he was going okay. So I called Walter about 6:45, 7 o'clock. He's like, yeah, I'm all right. I just, I lost track of time. I forgot to call you, my bad. And he's like, but I'm gonna call you before I come home because I wanna know what you need from the store. So I said, okay. Around 7:55, he called me. Automatically, I'm thinking he's in the grocery store. Let me tell him what I want. So I'm like, yeah, I want some strawberries and I want some bananas and make sure you get some cereal for the kids for in the morning. And he's like, Tia, stop. I said, well, what? Tia, I've been shot. He sounded okay, and I thought he was playing with me.
For about a whole minute of that phone call, she believes he's joking.
He says, no, I've really been shot. And then he's paused. His whole demeanor, everything changed. He paused, and now I'm taking him seriously because now I could tell something is wrong. And so I started going into questions. Where are you at? Tell me where you are. What's going on? Where were you shot? You know, I'm asking 1,000,001 questions, and the only thing he's saying is that he couldn't breathe. You know, I can't breathe. Oh my God, I can't breathe. I can't breathe. Then he stops for a minute, and then he says, I love you and the kids, and to take care of the kids. He stopped responding. We've always had the relationship of getting to one another when we needed to. And I couldn't get to him. I didn't know where he was.
Desperate and unsure what to do, Latia started calling local hospitals.
The only thing that could go through my head was, what am I gonna do now? Well, I'm here by myself. I got my kids. How am I gonna tell these kids?
Police ask Latia if she knows anyone who might have been after Walter.
They want to know exactly what could have caused this homicide, if he had any enemies or any known people in the area that would want to harm him. Latia makes them aware that they had literally just moved.
He had just really come here from South Carolina with his family, and then before that was from Long Island.
The only information Latia has is that Walter had been with his cousin in the hours before he died.
I thought he had gotten into it with somebody. That's the only, explanation that I could have come up with.
She gives the address where Walter's cousin lives, just a block away. Investigators hope that he can shed light on what went down in Walter's final hours.
At this point, detectives have more questions than answers.
It's really about talking to people.
Just hours after the fatal shooting of Walter Bell, Syracuse detectives head to the residence where Walter's cousin lives with friends. Police learn they had welcomed Walter when he arrived in Syracuse.
Mr. Bell had lived with them when he first moved up from South Carolina. They were very cooperative.
The group tells police that Walter was still learning the nuances of street politics on the North Side. In fact, they said Walter made a near-fatal blunder a couple days before by walking on Catherine Street, the same street where he ultimately lost his life.
They told us that he had been shot at just a couple days before that, less than half a block from the incident. And his friends that they lived with on Lodi Street, which is right around the corner, warned him and kept telling him, hey, you shouldn't hang out over there.
Investigators consider whether Walter was unknowingly caught up in a neighborhood feud.
Mr. Bell may not have been a direct target.
They don't know if the target was Walter Bell or if it was Shavoki Bloodworth.
Detectives ask the group what they know about the other shooting victim. They say that despite what he told police at the scene, Walter and Shavoki did know each other.
Mr. Bloodworth and Mr. Bell were known as friends. They would often hang out together.
Investigators question why he would hold back.
Now, investigators want to talk to Shavoki Bloodworth to see exactly what he knows.
Before they do, one of Walter's friends offers information about a man he says is at the center of the neighborhood feud.
We heard the name of Mr. Acevedo from the friends of Mr. Bell. All he knew by his nickname, so he accompanied the police in an unmarked vehicle and pointed out the house that it turns out to be Mr. Acevedo's house.
Unfortunately, he isn't home. Investigators shift their focus back to Shavoki Bloodworth and conduct a background search.
Mr. Bloodworth had been involved in the criminal justice system. He had been arrested for dealing drugs. There was some robbery, type street robbery thing. There was probably a dispute that turned bad. So he had been around, he had been in the game, as we'll say.
In the early morning hours of October 20th, Shavoki Bloodworth agrees to come to the station for another interview. At first, Shavoki maintains his story, saying he didn't know Walter Bell or anything about the shooters.
The detective, as he was talking to him, and this is, of course, over a course of a few hours, finally told him, he said, listen, the guy that you were standing there next to, he did pass away. And Mr. Bloodworth actually became emotional over this and broke down in tears. Mr. Bloodworth told the detective that, he goes, okay, he is a friend of mine. I see him every day. And he actually even said that he felt he was a father figure to him. So then he gave a little bit more information.
Shavoki admits he has been involved in the feud and fears that he was the intended target of the shooting, not Walter.
But that's oftentimes how it works. The bad guys, they don't care. They'll take collateral damage. And oftentimes it's revenge, retaliation, revenge, retaliation.
Shavoki still says he didn't see who fired the shots, but thinks there could be a clue in Walter's dying words.
Mr. Bloodworth even tells the detective that our victim, Mr. Bell, says, look out for streets, as he's dying.
Detectives recognize the nickname.
John Lundy was on parole and had just gotten out of state prison.
26-year-old Drawn is often spotted around town with his brother, 21-year-old Quincy.
Quincy and John Lundy were known to the police. They had been involved in the criminal justice system, being arrested on numerous different occasions for a variety of crimes.
That sets off a bunch of bells in the detective's head, because those brothers have a long rap sheet in the area.
Within hours of the fatal shooting of Walter Bell, investigators have the names of two men who may have been involved.
John Lundy actually had just gotten out of prison. Quincy, who's the younger brother, also has multiple arrests in the area for misdemeanors and felonies, and was also shot himself back in 2009.
Before they reach out to the brothers, investigators attempt to track down the man Walter's friend said was at the center of a neighborhood feud, 20-year-old Jason Acevedo.
Mr. Acevedo was attempted to be located a few different times. Once they finally locate him, he was very uncooperative and denied knowing anything.
Detectives refuse to give up. They continue to press Acevedo for information.
It's almost a lost art, is that one-on-one communication and trying to win over people, get them to give you information. Really is an art form. And, those are the detectives that are the better detectives are people that know how to do that and actually can spend that time necessary to build a relationship.
Eventually, Jason admits to a feud between himself and the Lundy brothers.
He actually gives some of the story, the backstory too, of him being involved in physical altercations with Quincy Lundy, of actual physical fights that occurred in the street in the weeks leading up to the death of Mr. Bell.
Following the interview, investigators begin piecing together the puzzle. In the months prior, the Lundy family had filed a police report.
The Lundy's parents called in that their house was shot up. The police respond, police do a report, they look for shell casings, do what they can to investigate the crime.
No one was charged. But now, investigators consider whether Jason Acevedo was responsible.
He described the fight that he had with Mr. Lundy. He kind of got the worst of it. So that probably is what led to the shootings up of the homes of the Lundy brothers.
The belief that Acevedo was responsible left the Lundy brothers thirsty for revenge.
Their house was shot up in the months leading up to Mr. Bell's death. So they were probably going to exact revenge.
Investigators are still unsure how Walter and Shavoki got caught in the crossfire. They return to the eyewitnesses who described seeing two men flee from the scene of Walter's shooting. Investigators present them with a photo array containing mugshots of Drawn and Quincy Lundy.
They have a really good witness who identifies them, which is pretty powerful because she doesn't know them, was able to quickly point them out of a photo array. Not enough to arrest them, but then everything kept coming back to them.
Detectives reach out to the brothers, who agree to come in for a statement.
Both Lundy brothers voluntarily came in. They didn't arrive together, as I recall, but they were interviewed the same day. They didn't admit to doing this crime, but they admitted that Quincy Lundy was involved in fights with other people that hang out in that area, including Mr. Acevedo.
Quincy says he was not there. He was at home with his mom watching television. Drawn says he's nowhere near Catherine Street during the shooting. He wasn't even on the north side. And that was something that could be easily verified at that time because he had on an ankle bracelet.
Drawn was released from New York State Prison 11 months earlier with a GPS tracking device as a condition of his probation.
The detectives spoke with parole officials. They had said that Mr. Lundy was nowhere near Catherine Street at the time of this incident.
Now they have an eyewitness on scene saying that it was the Lundy brothers, which is a complete contradiction from what they found out from the ankle monitor.
Investigators consider an alternative theory.
They're looking as, okay, so maybe Drawn wasn't there. Was Quincy there with someone else, right?
But Quincy's mom backs up his alibi, stating her son was with her on the night Walter was killed.
Now, mom, sometimes, they could be looking out for their kid, right? So we'll take that with a grain of salt, but the mom seemed earnest enough when she was interviewed and pretty certain. So the detectives were kind of back to square one.
The investigation stalls. Walter's loved ones are left in the lurch. Grieving, pregnant, and alone, Latia lives in fear.
Everybody's worried about me now because I'm in a place where I don't know anyone. I don't have any support. I left Syracuse within 24 hours of Walter passing. And I moved back to Long Island. I stopped speaking to detectives. Reason being, I started getting calls on my personal phone, and it would be people portraying to be detectives. And so now I didn't trust anyone. And I still didn't quite know the story of what happened, so I'm scared. I don't trust anyone, and I felt like they were trying to figure out where I had moved to. And I didn't want anyone to know where I was.
In the months following the murder of Walter Bell, his friends and family members are overwhelmed by the loss. 3 months after his death, Walter's daughter is born.
I gave birth January 29th, 2013. And she was born prematurely. She was born at 28 weeks. When I looked at my baby, I looked at her and I broke down and cried. Reason being, the first thing that I saw when I looked at her, she looked just like her dad did, laying in the casket.
He always talk about when I have a little girl, her name's gonna be Destiny Nicole Bell. All the time, he just wanted a little girl. He got what he finally wanted, and he's not here for it.
Adding to the family's pain, the investigation into Walter's murder is at a standstill. his killer or killers are still out there. In the summer of 2013, almost 9 months after the shootings, Jason Acevedo is arrested in connection with a string of burglaries. But Jason has another crime on his mind.
Mr. Acevedo, with his conjunction with his lawyer, thought it might be in his best interest to now cooperate in this case to give a more satisfactory resolution to his pending felonies. So his lawyer reached out to the police and the district attorney's office and volunteered his client to cooperate.
Jason reveals that he was there when Walter Bell was shot and can tell them exactly who committed the crime.
Prosecutors make a deal, offering Jason Acevedo a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony.
Jason reveals that on October 19, 2012, he was standing on the sidewalk talking to Walter Bell and Shavoki Bloodworth when he was approached by the Lundy brothers. And it was at that point, shots rang out.
Acevedo says both Lundy brothers pulled out guns and started firing at him, Walter, and their friend, Shavoki Bloodworth.
It appears from the investigation, Mr. Acevedo was actually a primary target. That's probably the guy they really would like to have shot that night.
But Jason escaped unscathed. He fled the scene and didn't know Walter had been killed until he saw it on the news 2 weeks later.
His background, if you will, his basis of knowledge that he finally comes through with is pretty high. And so, his credibility, though he's looking out for his own best interest, his credibility in this case is good.
But his statement goes against what would appear to be irrefutable evidence. The data from John Lundy's ankle bracelet.
So that's when they would go back to the ankle monitor and actually start to look at it more closely. In Onondaga County, we have a crime analysis center. One of the analysts there, they were able to look at it more scientifically, and that's when they realized that that the first parole officer looked at it and misread it, or possibly wasn't looking at the actual time that the detective gave him. All of a sudden, okay, boom.
John, in fact, was on Catherine Street that night. At that point, detectives immediately issue a warrant for John Lundy's arrest for the second-degree murder of Walter Bell.
Based on Jason Acevedo's statement, authorities also issue an arrest warrant for Quincy Lundy. He turns himself in.
He was re-interviewed, but didn't give a lot of information. He was arrested for murder in the second degree.
John Lundy remains at large.
They asked the family for John to call them. They said, well, he's in Texas somewhere. He actually does call the detectives within a day or two and actually left an address that he lived in. But the address was was a fraudulent one. So the U.S. Marshals Task Force in that area started to knock on doors and see if they could find Mr. Lundy.
Months after Walter Bell was gunned down, Syracuse police finally have enough to charge the two men they believe are responsible.
A warrant is issued for the Lundy brothers' arrests. Quincy is first arrested, but then they discover John Lundy flees to Texas.
Investigators do what they can to flush him out, including enlisting the help of the U.S. Marshals and putting pressure on his family.
The police up here at Syracuse still knocking on grandma's and parents' doors. Those efforts must have been enough. Mr. Lundy actually, within a few days thereafter, walks in and turns himself in to a police department down outside of Dallas, Texas. And then he's arrested and later extradited back here to face the charges.
When they finally get John Lundy in custody, he's sticking to the story that he was not anywhere near Catherine Street and that he only heard about the gunshots. But police knew there was more to the story.
Drawn and Quincy Lundy are tried together in October 2014. Latia attends the trial with Walter's mother.
I want to look these guys in their face. I want to know what happened and why it happened.
Deputy Mark Chapman is assigned to transport the brothers to and from court each day.
My partner and I were present throughout the whole trial because of the brothers' custody status. They looked like, college students. They were very quiet, very disciplined in the courtroom.
Quincy Lundy's attorney sticks to the story that Quincy has nothing to do with this shooting and he was at home with his mother. And his mother continues to corroborate the story. She takes the stand to testify for him, but Quincy himself doesn't take the stand. Drawn, on the other hand, takes the stand in his own defense. He admits to the criminal history and admits to the feud with Acevedo, but is adamant about the fact that he had nothing to do with the shooting and did not shoot anyone.
This case was, somewhat circumstantial. We didn't have a murder weapon. They didn't have fingerprint evidence. They didn't have DNA evidence. There wasn't, clear, perfect video. There wasn't a confession. I pictured myself as a juror saying, this could go either way.
Prosecutors attempt to bolster their case by calling the county medical examiner.
Dr. Stoppinger's testimony, they have ways to follow the bullet path as it enters and potentially exits the body. The doctor testified that it appeared that the rounds striking Mr. Bell came from a downward angle. After his testimony, the court took a brief recess. We escorted both brothers from the courtroom to a holding area adjacent to the courtroom and secured them in a holding cell.
Officer Chapman and his partner listen in as the brothers discuss the testimony.
Quincy Lundy said, this doctor is very good for us, for our case. And they then went on to say that it's good for us because we were shooting from up the hill. My partner and I, we look at each other in kind of disbelief. We're like, they basically just confessed to each other that they were shooting.
When the trial resumes, the deputies tell prosecutors what they overheard.
I was hesitant, but law enforcement, we have to adapt. And we did. We testified to exactly what we heard that day.
On October 24th, 2014, the jury returns its verdict.
They were both found guilty of murder in the second degree in Onondaga County Court and were sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. It wasn't just justice for Walter Bell and his family. It was an effort to stop the violence, right? We're always looking to try to stop the violence because this would have kept going.
When the verdict came in, I got a call from Tia. I was happy, but I said still don't take away the pain because, it's no sentence gonna amount to the amount of pain that they caused us. I guess you just have to learn to deal with it. You just learn to deal with it.
That verdict just basically told me to get on with life. Get on with your life. Today, I'm a mother of 5. I'm married now. I'm happy. My happy ending is my babies. Finding someone that accepted me and my babies. To raise them. Destiny has never met or talked to her father.
She has his ways. Like, you could just look in her eyes and you just know that he's there. He's there.
In this first chapter of our extensive chronicle, we step back into the freezing winter of 1989 to confront the moment that shattered the collective psyche of a nation. On December 6th, the École Polytechnique in Montreal, a bastion of scientific progress and rational thought, became the stage for a tragedy that would rewrite the history of gender-based violence in Canada. This chapter is not merely an account of the events of that day. It is an investigation into the atmosphere that preceded the darkness and the sudden, violent rupture of normalcy that occurred when the world stopped turning for the families of 14 brilliant young women. To understand the weight of that day, we must first transport ourselves to the environment of Montreal at the end of the 80s. It was a time of transition where the promise of technical education was opening doors for women in fields traditionally dominated by men. The École Polytechnique was a symbol of this shift, a place of ambition, late-night study sessions, and the optimistic hum of a generation preparing to build the future. Yet, beneath this surface of progress, toxic currents of resentment were quietly gathering, fueled by a specific, virulent form of misogyny that viewed the advancement of women not as an achievement, but as an existential threat to a world order that was rapidly changing. The narrative of this chapter focuses on the afternoon of December 6th. We reconstruct the timeline with a precision born of decades of forensic study and collective memory. For those present, the day began with the rhythm of final exams and the typical exhaustion of engineering students. But by late afternoon, that rhythm was violently disrupted. The arrival of Marc Lépine at the university was the introduction of a force of destruction that the institution was fundamentally unprepared to process. We examine the specific actions taken by the perpetrator, not to glorify his violence, an act we strictly reject, but to understand the calculated nature of his assault. This was not a random outburst of rage, it was a targeted execution. A critical element of this opening chapter is the identification of the intent. When Lépine separated the men from the women in the classrooms, he was not acting out of insanity, as some early reports desperately tried to suggest. He was acting out of a clear, ideological conviction. By shouting his hatred for feminists, he transformed the classrooms into a battlefield where the struggle for gender equality was met with the ultimate form of suppression. The trauma of that moment is etched into the walls of the university, and for years, those who survived carried the weight of the realization that they were targeted precisely because of who they were and what they represented. We also pay tribute to the lives lost: Genevieve Bergeron, Helene Colgan, Natalie Croteau, Barbara Daigneault, Anne-Marie Edward, Maud Haviernick, Barbara Maria Kluxnick, Maurice Lagunier, Maurice Leclerc, Anne-Marie Lemay, Sonia Pelletier, Michelle Richard, Annie S.D. Arnault, and Annie Turcotte. In this chapter, we seek to humanize the statistics. We tell the stories of who they were: young women with aspirations to be engineers, to solve complex problems, to build structures, and to contribute to society. By naming them, we reclaim them from the anonymity of victimhood and restore their identity as the protagonists of their own potential futures. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of chaos and disbelief. We explore the limitations of the security protocols of 1989 and the shock that rippled through the police force and the administration. The sirens echoing through the streets of Montreal that night signaled not just a local tragedy, but the beginning of a national reckoning. The media coverage in the hours following the massacre reveals a society struggling to find the vocabulary for what had happened. There was a palpable friction between those who wanted to treat this as an isolated case of a disturbed individual, and those who sensed, even then, that this was a symptom of a larger, systemic disease. We also examine the role of the students and professors who were present. Their accounts are the primary source material for this opening chapter. The courage displayed by those who tried to protect their classmates and the paralyzing terror experienced by those who hid in the dark are threads that weave together a tapestry of immense grief. The research highlights the isolation felt by many in those first few hours. The university, which had been a home for knowledge and collaboration, was suddenly an alien, hostile space. The silence that followed the gunfire was deafening, signaling the end of an era of innocence for the Canadian academic community. As we move forward in this series, it is essential to ground ourselves in the gravity of these facts. This first chapter sets the stage for everything that follows: the legislative battles, the shifts in cultural awareness, the architectural changes in memory, and the global movement that surged from the ashes of the École Polytechnique. The massacre was the spark, the response of the community, and the world became the fire that, for better or worse, forged our contemporary understanding of gender, violence, and institutional responsibility. Reflecting on the atmosphere of 1989 from our current vantage point in 2026, we see how much the world has changed and, simultaneously, how much remains the same. The rhetoric of the attacker, while extreme, shared the same roots as the exclusionary language we still combat today in online forums and social discourse. By revisiting the beginning, we are not just looking back. We are identifying the roots of the tree of violence so that we might better understand how to prune it, or perhaps, how to ensure it never takes hold again. The tone of this chapter is one of solemnity and resolve. We recognize that to talk about the École Polytechnique is to walk on hallowed ground. Every detail we recount is a tribute to the necessity of never forgetting. The tragedy was a rupture, but it was also a foundation. It forced an entire country to look at its own reflection and decide whether it was comfortable with what it saw. This chapter is the invitation to start that process of reflection. As we conclude this inaugural installment, we keep our focus on the human cost. 14 futures were erased, but in their absence, a powerful force of memory was born. We invite the listener and reader to walk with us through these events not as voyeurs of tragedy, but as witnesses to history. We hold the memory of these 14 women as a standard, a point of departure for all the conversations we are about to have regarding justice, policy, education, and the future of human coexistence. The beginning of the story is the most painful, but it is also the most defining. By naming the darkness, we prepare ourselves to appreciate the light that emerged from the subsequent decades of struggle. We recognize that the École Polytechnique is not defined by the hate of one man, but by the resilience of an entire society that refused to be cowed. This is where our journey into the depth of that December day begins, acknowledging the pain, honoring the victims, and committing to the long, necessary process of understanding that has defined the last 4 decades. We start here, grounded in the truth, as we begin to map the landscape of a history that changed the world. In this second chapter of our chronicle, we move beyond the immediate shock of the December 6th tragedy to explore the seismic shifts in public discourse that followed the massacre. If the first chapter was an exploration of the darkness and the raw events of that day, this installment is an investigation into the aftermath of silence, the process by which a nation, initially stunned and paralyzed, began to find the language to process what had occurred. We trace the transformation of a local tragedy into a catalyst for a national consciousness shift regarding gender, power, and the structural nature of violence. The immediate reaction across Canada was a complex mix of denial and profound sorrow. In the days following the shooting, the media, the government, and the university administration were caught in a struggle to define the event. For many, it was easier to classify Marc Lépine as a lone wolf, a singular, broken entity whose actions were a chaotic aberration rather than a reflection of a larger societal issue. This framing, which we examine in detail, was a defense mechanism, a way to maintain the illusion of a safe and stable society. However, this narrative was quickly challenged by women's groups, activists, and crucially, the families of the victims, who refused to let the political context of the crime be sanitized or erased. We examine the emergence of the misogyny debate. For the first time in mainstream Canadian media, the term feminicide began to circulate, not as an academic abstraction, but as a descriptor for the calculated targeting of women. We document the fierce debates that broke out in newsrooms, coffee shops, and parliaments across the country. Were these women targeted because they were women, or was it a mere coincidence of location? The evidence provided by the survivors, the chilling accounts of the shooters separating the men from the women, made the answer undeniable to those who were willing to listen. This chapter delves into the tension between those who desperately wanted to ignore the gendered nature of the crime and those who demanded that the misogynistic motivation be placed at the very center of the investigation. This period also marked the beginning of a massive mobilization of the Canadian feminist movement. The trauma of the École Polytechnique acted as a shock to the system. Vigils held in Montreal and subsequently across Canada were not just expressions of mourning. They were manifestations of political resolve. We reconstruct these gatherings, describing the sea of candles, the somber faces, and the collective realization that the progress of the previous decades had been met with a violent, reactionary force. The massacre was seen not as a final, tragic event, but as a warning. The path to equality was fraught with danger, and the resistance to that equality was more lethal than many had dared to imagine. We turn our attention to the specific challenges faced by the engineering community. The École Polytechnique, as a professional and academic environment, had to face a painful mirror. How could an institution of higher learning be the site of such virulent anti-woman sentiment? We analyze the internal reviews and the soul-searching that occurred within the faculty. The realization that women in STEM fields were viewed by some as interlopers was a profound revelation. This led to the first concerted efforts to foster inclusive environments in engineering, setting the groundwork for the policies we see in 2026. This chapter highlights how the pain of the loss was translated into structural reform, as professors and students demanded an academic culture that was not only safe but also welcoming. A crucial focus of this chapter is the political response, specifically the movement for stricter gun control. The massacre was the immediate trigger for a national debate that remains relevant even in the present day. We follow the tireless efforts of families like those of the victims who, despite their personal grief, took on the mantle of lobbyists, demanding that the government recognize the danger of high-capacity weaponry in the hands of unstable individuals. This was the birth of a long-standing, often contentious debate in Canada. We provide an overview of the arguments on both sides and show how the personal tragedy of December 6th was the starting point for legislative changes that would redefine Canadian identity for decades to come. We also examine the psychological impact on the survivors. The weight of survivors' guilt, the trauma of witnessing such a targeted act of hatred, and the pressure of being the voice of the victims in a national conversation. These are themes that define the personal histories of those who lived through that afternoon. Through the accounts of survivors who have spoken out over the years, we understand that for them, the massacre was not a historical event to be analyzed, but a reality they navigated every day. We honor their resilience and their willingness to transform their own healing into a public service by ensuring that the truth of that day was never compromised. As we look at the late 1980s and early 1990s through the lens of this chapter, we see a country at a crossroads. The École Polytechnique massacre exposed the cracks in the foundation of Canadian society. It challenged the prevailing assumption that Canada was immune to the extreme gender-based violence that plagued other parts of the world. By forcing the nation to confront the reality of hate-motivated crime, the tragedy shattered the myth of the gentle Canadian and compelled a more honest, though painful, dialogue about the status of women, the prevalence of domestic and public violence, and the responsibility of the state to protect its citizens. The importance of this second chapter lies in its focus on the naming of the monster. If we cannot name a problem, we cannot solve it. The refusal of the public, the families, and the activists to accept the lone wolf narrative was an act of intellectual and moral courage. It forced society to look at the link between the shooter's specific words and the broader culture of misogyny. This process of naming and reclaiming the narrative is what we study here. It is a fundamental lesson in how societies recover from catastrophe, by not allowing the truth to be buried alongside the victims. Reflecting on this early period from our perspective in 2026, we see the echoes of these same debates in our current social media discourse. We witness the same attempts to minimize gender-based violence and the same resistance to acknowledging systemic problems. The lessons from 1989 remain incredibly pertinent. By documenting how the initial narratives were constructed, challenged, and eventually shifted toward a more truthful recognition of the crime, we provide a blueprint for how to respond to contemporary crises. This chapter is also a testament to the power of collective memory. The vigils and the ongoing commemorations that started in the weeks after the massacre evolved into a national ritual that persists to this day. We see how these rituals served a vital function. They kept the pain present, preventing the society from sliding back into indifference. The act of gathering, of speaking the victims' names, and of refusing to let the event become just another headline was the most potent weapon the community possessed. As we conclude this exploration of the aftermath, we acknowledge that the process of finding the language was only the beginning. The shift in consciousness that started in 1989 required constant maintenance and reinforcement. It was not a single event, but a continuous commitment to truth-telling. We set the stage for the following chapters, where we will examine the legal battles, the institutional changes, and the long-term impact on global movements. We leave the reader with the image of a nation that, having lost its innocence in a moment of unimaginable cruelty, began the slow, difficult process of building a more just, aware, and protective society for all. The foundations of that future were laid in the days, weeks, and months that followed the terror. Days of grief, yes, but also days of profound, irrevocable awakening. In this third chapter of our chronicle, we move beyond the immediate aftermath and the initial national shock to investigate the institutional architecture of silence that existed prior to the tragedy and the subsequent architecture of accountability that emerged from its ashes. If the first two chapters focused on the horror and the raw awakening of the public, this chapter delves into the often dry, yet fundamentally important realm of policy, university governance, and the systemic failure to protect women within the academy. We examine how the École Polytechnique and the broader Canadian educational system were forced to tear down walls, both literal and metaphorical, to create an environment of genuine inclusion. To understand the scale of the failure, we must look at what safety meant for an engineering student in the late 1980s. For the administration of the École Polytechnique, security was largely focused on preventing theft, managing building access, and responding to traditional emergency scenarios like fire. The concept of gender-based violence as a risk factor for campus safety was simply not on the agenda. We reconstruct the administrative atmosphere of the time, where the idea that a student could be targeted for her gender within the hallowed halls of a university was dismissed as an impossibility, a relic of a past that Canada believed it had outgrown. This chapter exposes that dangerous complacency. We provide a detailed investigation into the structural misogyny of the engineering profession at the time. Through archival research and interviews with graduates from that era, we paint a picture of a field where women were frequently isolated, subject to casual harassment, and often told that their struggle to be taken seriously was a personal failing rather than a systemic issue. The tragedy served as a brutal, irrevocable proof that these experiences were not minor incidents, but the symptoms of a climate that could, in the worst possible case, prove fatal. The university had to confront the reality that by failing to address the minor instances of exclusion, it had helped create an environment where a radicalized individual felt empowered to take action. The core of this chapter is the transformation of the university's institutional response. We follow the grueling, often painful process of the official commissions of inquiry. These bodies were tasked with answering the how and the why. They weren't just investigating the actions of one man. They were interrogating the institution itself. We examined the findings regarding campus security, the reporting mechanisms for harassment, and the lack of support systems for students dealing with discrimination. This section is a masterclass in institutional accountability, showing how an organization, when faced with an existential crisis, can choose to either defend its reputation or fundamentally change its structure. We also focus on the role of the students who became activists. In the months following the massacre, the halls of the École Polytechnique were not just places of mourning. They were the sites of intense, radicalizing political organization. We highlight the stories of the student leaders who demanded that the university not just return to normal, because normal was exactly what had led to the violence. They fought for the implementation of equity offices, the creation of formal policies against gender-based harassment, and the inclusion of women's history and sociology in the engineering curriculum. This was the birth of a new kind of campus culture, one that recognized that intellectual excellence is impossible without social safety. Furthermore, we explore the resistance to these changes. The narrative of reform was not a smooth path. We document the friction between the older guard of the administration and the new voices of the student body. There were those who argued that the focus on gender was distracting from the technical rigor of the university, a sentiment that itself illustrates the depth of the challenge. We analyze the arguments made by both sides, providing a clear picture of how cultural shifts are never granted. They are hard-won through persistent, often exhausting struggle. This chapter serves as a historical record of the institutional growing pains of the early 1990s. A critical focus is placed on the design of space. We look at the architectural and procedural changes implemented at the university. This was not just about adding cameras or security guards. It was about reimagining the campus as a space that encouraged community and communication rather than silos. We discuss the redesign of common areas, the improvement of lighting, and the changes in emergency protocols. These were the first tangible signs that the institution had learned its lesson, that the physical space must reflect the values of the institution. If we want a university that values all its students, the physical environment must reflect that commitment. As we bridge the gap to the present day in 2026, we observe how these institutional changes became the standard for universities across Canada and eventually globally. The policies that were born in the heated, grief-stricken boardrooms of Montreal in 1990 have become the baseline for modern campus safety. By tracing this lineage, we emphasize that the safety and inclusion policies we often take for granted today were paid for by the lives of the 14 women. This chapter is a sobering reminder that every policy we have today is a testament to a hard-won realization. We also analyze the psychological shift within the faculty. For many professors who were present on that day, the tragedy fundamentally changed their role. They moved from being mere instructors of technical material to being mentors and protectors. We recount the testimonials of educators who describe how they began to notice the quiet student in the back of the room, how they changed their lecture styles to be more inclusive, and how they started to hold their colleagues accountable for biased language. The faculty transformed from an academic body into a community that took responsibility for the well-being of the next generation. The importance of this third chapter lies in its demonstration of organizational resilience. It shows that when an institution is broken, it can be put back together in a way that is stronger, more sensitive, and more aware. We provide this analysis not as a pat on the back for the university, but as a roadmap for any institution facing its own failures. The lesson is that institutions do not change because they want to. They change because they are forced to, and the responsibility of the community is to ensure that the force applied is sufficient to cause lasting, structural change. As we wrap up this exploration of institutional change, we set the stage for the next phase of our story, the legal battles that would reach the highest courts in the land. We have established that the university failed, that the system was inadequate, and that the community demanded a new way of existing. Now we must see how these demands were translated into the rigid language of the law. We leave the reader with a sense of the momentum that was building, a momentum that would eventually reach the halls of government and force the state itself to confront the reality of the weaponized misogyny that had been exposed in Montreal. The institutional fire was lit, and the legal battle was about to begin. In this fourth chapter of our chronicle, we transition from the immediate trauma and the institutional response of the university to the broader, often contentious landscape of the Canadian legal system. If the previous chapters were about the personal grief and the internal transformation of the École Polytechnique, this installment is an investigation into the legal reckoning. We explore how the law, a system designed to be objective and blind, struggled to interpret an act of violence that was fundamentally rooted in prejudice. This chapter serves as an analysis of the limits and the evolution of the Canadian judicial framework when confronted with the brutal reality of feminicide. The central tension of this legal analysis lies in the conflict between the letter of the law and the social reality of the crime. In 1989, the Canadian Criminal Code, much like the laws in many Western democracies, was ill-equipped to categorize hate-motivated crimes against women. The legal system prioritized the action, the physical act of killing, over the motive, the ideological hatred of women. As we review the legal discourse of the time, we uncover a persistent reluctance to incorporate misogyny as a valid legal concept. The defense of the lone wolf narrative was not just a media strategy. It was a deeply ingrained legal strategy, aimed at stripping the crime of its political significance to avoid the complex implications of systemic gender-based violence. We devote significant attention to the intense public debate that raged during the post-massacre years. Legal scholars, activists, and government officials engaged in a profound, often exhausting struggle to redefine what constitutes a hate crime. We reconstruct the arguments presented before various legislative committees, where the families of the victims, bolstered by women's advocacy groups, fought for the inclusion of gender as a protected category in hate speech and hate crime legislation. This chapter provides a detailed examination of the legal resistance they encountered, documenting how conservative factions argued that focusing on gender would introduce subjective, identity-based politics into an otherwise neutral justice system. A critical turning point in our narrative is the debate surrounding the registry of firearms and the broader legislative movement towards strict gun control. This was not merely an administrative change. It was a constitutional battle over the definition of individual rights versus the state's duty to protect. we analyze the legal maneuvers used by both sides. Proponents of the registry argued that the state has an inherent responsibility to restrict dangerous weapons that facilitate mass violence. Opponents framed it as an infringement on the rights of law-abiding citizens. By situating this debate in the immediate context of the 1989 massacre, we illustrate how the legal system became an arena where the nation's core values were contested. We further explore the limitations of the justice system in the 1990s in providing closure to the survivors and the families. For many, the legal process felt less like a quest for truth and more like a series of bureaucratic hurdles. We recount the frustrations of those who witnessed the legal system's slow, often detached pace, contrasting it with the raw, immediate pain of the families. The chapter highlights the disconnect between the cold, procedural requirements of a courtroom and the human need for acknowledgement of the ideological nature of the crime. This analysis is crucial for understanding why so many felt that the law had failed, not because it hadn't sentenced a perpetrator, he had already taken his own life, but because it had failed to address the systemic issue that allowed the crime to happen. Another essential facet of this legal inquiry is the emergence of restorative justice models and the shifting focus of victim advocacy. The aftermath of the Montreal massacre paved the way for victim impact statements to become a formal part of the Canadian legal process. We trace the history of this shift, showing how the families of the victims turned their personal testimonies into a powerful tool for judicial reform. By forcing the courts to confront the lasting impact of the crime on the survivors and the broader community, they fundamentally changed how the legal system recognizes the humanity of those left behind. This chapter documents how the voices of the families became an unintended, yet essential, legal force. The legal journey also forced a re-examination of how Canada manages the intersection of mental health and criminal intent. The discourse at the time often confused the perpetrator's extremist ideology with a clinical madness. We provide an expert-led analysis of this distinction, detailing how the legal system struggled to maintain the separation between the two. This section is vital for our current understanding of domestic radicalization, as we see the same debates resurfacing today. By revisiting how the legal system dealt with this in the early 90s, we gain clarity on the traps of overpathologizing ideological hatred, a mistake we are still trying to avoid in 2026. We also highlight the international impact of Canada's legal reckoning. The debates that started in Montreal were observed globally, serving as a case study for the United Nations and other international human rights bodies regarding the classification of feminicide. We detail how Canada's legislative struggle influenced the development of international norms concerning violence against women, showing how a domestic legal trauma became an instrument of global policy. The École Polytechnique did not just influence Canadian law. It influenced the way the world conceptualizes the state's obligation to protect women from gender-based extremism. As we reach the conclusion of this chapter, we reflect on the long-term impact of these legal struggles. While many of the demands made by activists in the early 90s were met with resistance, the cumulative effect of these battles created a new legal reality. The incorporation of gender-sensitive language into legislation, the strengthening of protections for victims, and the ongoing oversight of weapons are all direct descendants of the legal fights that began in the wake of the 1989 massacre. We emphasize that while the law may move slowly, the persistent advocacy of those who refuse to let the truth be sanitized can force the system to evolve. This fourth chapter serves as a bridge between the trauma of the past and the policy-oriented reality of the present. We leave the reader with a nuanced understanding of the law not as a static entity, but as a dynamic reflection of a society's values. The legal evolution following the Montreal massacre is a story of a nation's slow, agonizing, but necessary process of aligning its statutes with the reality of its citizens' lives. It is a testament to the fact that justice, in its most profound sense, is not just about the verdict of a trial, but about the systemic recognition of human rights and the state's duty to ensure that no one is targeted for who they are. As we look ahead to the next phase of our chronicle, the cultural and social shifts that permeated the arts, literature, and the collective memory, we keep the lessons of this legal battle firmly in mind. We have established that the systemic failures were real, the legal defenses were often obstructive, and the path to reform was fraught with difficulty. Yet through this, a clearer, more inclusive vision of justice began to emerge. The law, though tested and found wanting at first, eventually became a vehicle for a fundamental shift in how Canada protects its own. This is the enduring legacy of the legal struggle post-December 6, and it remains a core pillar of the narrative we are mapping. In this fifth chapter of our chronicle, we transition from the rigid corridors of the courtroom to the evocative, often visceral domain of culture, art, and public memory. If the legal battles of the previous chapter were about defining justice through statutes and procedures, this installment is an investigation into how a society digests trauma through the symbolic language of creativity. We explore the profound role that literature, film, memorialization, and the arts have played in ensuring that the École Polytechnique massacre did not fade into the abstraction of historical data, but remained a living, breathing component of the Canadian conscience. The central thesis of this chapter is the distinction between passive remembrance and active memorialization. In the immediate aftermath, there was a risk that the event would be reduced to a momentary tragedy marked only by a plaque in a lobby. Instead, what emerged was a decades-long, multifaceted cultural project. We examined the first waves of artistic expression, the poems, the paintings, and the musical tributes that began to appear within months of the tragedy. These early works served a vital purpose. They allowed the community to express an anguish that the formal legal proceedings could not contain. We document how these creative acts acted as a communal container for grief, providing a bridge between individual loss and public recognition. We turn our attention to the specific challenges faced by artists in grappling with the gendered nature of the crime. For many, the challenge was to create work that honored the lives of the 14 women without inadvertently romanticizing their deaths or turning them into two-dimensional symbols of victimhood. We analyze the evolution of this artistic approach. We highlight works that focused on the vibrant, intellectual futures that were stolen, moving away from the focus on the shooter's ideology toward a focus on the women's aspirations. This shift in narrative perspective, from the perpetrator to the victims, was a crucial artistic intervention that fundamentally changed how the public related to the event. A significant portion of this chapter is devoted to the architecture of memory. We provide an in-depth look at the construction of public memorials, not just in Montreal, but across the country. We explore the philosophical underpinnings of these monuments. Why did society choose certain forms, certain materials, and certain locations? We contrast the monumental, often imposing styles of traditional memorials with the more intimate, contemplative spaces that were designed in the wake of the 1989 tragedy. These modern spaces, such as the White Rose monuments, focus on invitation rather than awe. They invite the citizen to pause, reflect, and engage in an ongoing dialogue with history. This architecture of intimacy is a direct, tangible manifestation of the shift in societal values that we have tracked through this series. We also examine the role of film and documentary storytelling. The École Polytechnique has been the subject of numerous investigations, both journalistic and fictionalized. We offer a critical review of these cinematic depictions. We analyze how filmmakers have struggled with the ethical minefield of recreating the massacre. We highlight the intense debates that occurred when these films were released. Was it a necessary act of public education, or was it a form of voyeurism that re-traumatized the survivors? By presenting these debates, we illustrate the ongoing tension in cultural production when it intersects with national tragedy. We document how these works have sparked conversations in schools and living rooms, keeping the memory alive for generations that were not yet born in 1989. The chapter further explores the ritualization of grief. We trace the evolution of the annual commemorations, documenting how these rituals moved from being solemn, closed events to becoming inclusive, community-wide demonstrations of solidarity. We discuss the symbolism of the White Ribbon Campaign and the significance of the December 6th candlelight vigils as performative acts of citizenship. These rituals are not merely habits. They are acts of resistance against the natural tendency of history to erode. We provide an analysis of the psychological function of these rituals, how they allow a community to collectively acknowledge its scars and, in doing so, prevent them from becoming invisible. A critical focus is placed on the literature of witness. We look at the essays, memoirs, and novels penned by those who witnessed the events or were deeply affected by them. We provide an analysis of the language used in these texts. It is here that we see the most profound articulation of the trauma, a language that is simultaneously precise, raw, and deeply reflective. We highlight the work of writers who have navigated the precarious boundary between personal testimony and social commentary, showing how their contributions have enriched our collective understanding of gender, violence, and institutional responsibility. We also explore the role of digital archives and new media in the preservation of this memory. As we approach our present day in 2026, the traditional methods of memorialization, monuments, and annual vigils are being augmented by digital repositories. We document how these digital spaces are being used to catalog not just the history of the event, but the history of the response to the event. This creates a reflexive record where future generations can study not only the massacre itself, but also how their predecessors chose to remember and process it. This is a crucial evolution in the project of collective memory. The importance of this fifth chapter lies in its demonstration of cultural resilience. It shows that when a society is hit by a trauma that defies easy explanation, it turns to its artists and its storytellers to make sense of the void. We provide this analysis to illustrate that culture is not a decorative addition to the process of social change. It is the engine that drives it. By transforming pain into symbol, by turning silence into narrative, the cultural response to the École Polytechnique massacre was the most effective instrument for ensuring that the lessons of the tragedy were not lost. As we wrap up this exploration of cultural memory, we set the stage for the next phase of our story, the internationalization of the movement. We have established how a local tragedy became a national reckoning, and how that reckoning was processed through the arts, monuments, and rituals. Now, we must examine how this Canadian experience began to permeate the global consciousness, influencing international policy and fueling human rights movements far beyond the borders of Quebec. We leave the reader with the image of a culture that, through the creative act, refused to be broken, instead using the fragments of its shattered innocence to build a more complex, honest, and resilient identity. The work of memory, we conclude, is a creative act, one that demands the constant participation of every member of the society to ensure that the light of the 14 lives continues to guide our path forward. In this sixth chapter of our chronicle, we widen our lens from the Canadian borders to examine the global echoes of the École Polytechnique massacre. If the previous chapters focused on the internal process of grief, cultural response, and legal reform within Canada, this installment is an investigation into how the tragedy of December 6, 1989, permeated the international consciousness, becoming a foundational case study for the global movement against gender-based violence. We trace the transformation of a local atrocity into a universal symbol that helped catalyze international human rights frameworks, proving that the struggle for gender equality is an interconnected, global endeavor. The narrative begins by mapping the rapid dissemination of the news in the pre-internet era. Despite the absence of today's instant digital saturation, the news of the massacre rippled across the globe with haunting speed. We document the reactions in international press offices, from Paris to Bogota, from Tokyo to Sydney. For many activists abroad, the massacre was not perceived as a distant Canadian event. It was seen as an ominous, shared reality, a mirror that reflected the vulnerability of women in academic and professional spaces worldwide. This chapter explores the international resonance of the tragedy. Why did this specific event, among so many others, become a rallying cry for the global feminist movement? We analyze the role of the United Nations and other intergovernmental bodies in the aftermath of the massacre. We follow the diplomatic efforts of Canadian representatives who, moved by the collective grief of their nation, pushed to broaden the international definition of human rights. This was a critical period in history where the concept of women's rights as human rights was gaining traction. We provide a detailed look at how the École Polytechnique massacre was used as a pedagogical tool in global human rights forums to illustrate the lethality of gender-based ideology. This section is essential for understanding how a domestic trauma became a pivot point for international policy. A significant portion of this chapter is devoted to the birth of the global vigil. We track how December 6th began to be commemorated in countries far removed from Canada. We document the emergence of international networks of solidarity, activists sharing strategies on gun control, sexual harassment policies, and the institutional protection of women in STEM. We highlight how the White Ribbon Campaign, which originated in Canada as a movement of men speaking out against violence against women, was adapted and integrated into the activism of disparate cultures. This is a story of cross-cultural fertilization, how a specific Canadian response became a template for global male engagement in the fight for gender equality. We also examine the theorization of feminicide on a global scale. We show how the specific language used by the perpetrator, his focus on feminists, provided a clarity of motive that allowed international scholars to categorize the act as a clear, ideological assault. This provided activists in regions suffering from high rates of domestic and public violence against women with a new, powerful vocabulary. We analyze the debates that occurred in academic circles in Latin America and Europe regarding the utility and the power of the term feminicide as a political tool. The tragedy of Montreal gave these movements the hard evidence they needed to argue that violence against women was not just an accumulation of individual crimes, but a structural reality of patriarchal societies. The chapter further explores the politics of emulation. We document how the Canadian experience, the difficult, often slow process of legislative reform, became a reference point for other nations. We recount the visits of international delegations to Montreal, where they sought to understand not just the tragedy, but the rebound effect. How the community had organized, how the university had changed, and how the political landscape had been altered. By analyzing these cross-border dialogues, we demonstrate that the École Polytechnique massacre did not just leave behind a trail of grief. It left behind a manual for resistance that has been translated, adapted, and applied in diverse legal and cultural contexts. A critical focus is placed on the resilience of the survivors who became international advocates. We share the stories of those who, in the years after 1989, traveled the world to give talks, attend conferences, and support grassroots movements in other countries. These individuals became the human face of the tragedy, shifting the focus from the identity of the shooter to the strength of those who survived. By sharing their personal narratives, they were able to bypass the cold, abstract nature of international policy and connect with the hearts of activists everywhere. This is a testament to the power of personal narrative as a diplomatic tool. We also address the challenges of the universalization of trauma. We provide a critical analysis of the pitfalls of applying a Western, Canadian-centric lens to problems that are deeply contextualized by local history and culture. We examine the pushback from activists in the Global South who argued that their struggle required different tools than those used in Montreal. This nuance is vital. We demonstrate that the international impact was not a monolithic exporting of a model, but a complex, often critical dialogue that forced the global movement to become more aware of the diverse ways in which misogyny manifests. As we reach the present day in 2026, we see how the internet has solidified these international networks. We document the rise of digital memory archives, where the stories of the Montreal 14 are told alongside the stories of victims of gender-based violence in every corner of the planet. This digital connectivity ensures that the massacre is never isolated in time or space. We provide an analysis of how this contemporary, decentralized form of activism maintains the flame of the original movement, ensuring that the global consciousness remains sharp and responsive. The importance of this sixth chapter lies in its demonstration of the universal nature of the fight for dignity. It shows that while the massacre was a uniquely Canadian trauma, the struggle it catalyzed is a common human project. We leave the reader with a clear understanding that the global movement against gender-based violence is a tapestry woven from threads of local experiences. The École Polytechnique was one of the most prominent, most painful threads in that tapestry, but its importance is defined by how it helped pull all the other threads together. As we wrap up this exploration of the global impact, we set the stage for the next phase of our story, the technological transformation of our memory systems. We have seen how the massacre moved from a local room in Montreal to the world stage. Now we must look at how we are currently engineering the digital architecture of our own society to ensure that the memory of such events is not just preserved, but utilized as a protective mechanism. We leave the reader with the image of a world that, through the lens of a shared painful past, has become inextricably linked in the project of protecting the future of all women. The work of global solidarity, we conclude, is the only way to ensure that the darkness of 1989 never becomes the standard of our shared future. In this seventh chapter, we pivot to the evolution of the engineering of ethics, a central pillar in our narrative that examines how the profession of engineering, the very domain targeted on that December afternoon, underwent a profound transformation in its ethical and educational standards. If the previous chapter looked outward to the global movement, this chapter looks inward at the technical discipline, investigating how the trauma of 1989 forced a reckoning within the laboratories, the lecture halls, and the professional associations that govern the practice of engineering. The core of our inquiry is the paradigm shift that occurred in the early 1990s. Before the tragedy, engineering ethics in many Canadian universities were primarily focused on safety in a physical sense. The structural integrity of bridges, the stability of electrical grids, and the prevention of industrial accidents. The concept of human safety was narrowly defined by mechanical failure. The massacre at the École Polytechnique shattered this limited definition, forcing the profession to realize that the most dangerous failure in an engineering environment was not a structural defect, but the failure to foster an inclusive, human-centric culture. This chapter documents how social engineering and ethical engagement became as vital to the curriculum as calculus and thermodynamics. We analyze the implementation of mandatory ethics courses that began to surface in the wake of the disaster. These were not merely theoretical exercises. They were designed as experiential learning modules that confronted the reality of gender bias, institutional power dynamics, and the responsibility of the engineer to the public. We provide a detailed look at how these courses were structured, drawing on testimonies from the educators who led this charge. Their goal was clear: to ensure that the next generation of engineers would enter the field not just as technicians, but as guardians of the public good, equipped with the tools to recognize and dismantle the exclusionary practices that had contributed to the atmosphere of 1989. A crucial focus is placed on the role of professional associations, such as Engineers Canada. These bodies, often characterized by their conservatism, found themselves at the epicenter of the crisis. We trace the long, arduous process of professional reform, where associations moved to codify ethics of non-discrimination and equality into their governing charters. This was a monumental task, involving the reconciliation of tradition with the urgent demands for justice. We explore the internal friction that accompanied these changes, documenting the voices of those who resisted the politicization of the profession and the counter-arguments of those who maintained that an engineer who ignores the human context of their work is a dangerous liability. We further investigate the evolution of inclusive design. This is where the tragedy moved from the realm of policy into the realm of innovation. We showcase how the push for gender parity in STEM fields, fueled by the memory of the 14 women, led to a more diverse workforce, a workforce that brought broader perspectives to the design table. By analyzing the engineering breakthroughs of the 1990s and 2000s, we illustrate how the increase in women's participation in technical roles led to more innovative, safer, and more user-centric solutions. This was a vindication of the argument that the exclusionary practices of the past were not just morally wrong. They were a significant hindrance to technical progress. The chapter also delves into the psychology of the classroom. We analyze the work of educators who implemented safe space protocols long before the term became a staple of campus discourse. These professors recognized that for learning to take place, the environment must be free from the subtle, everyday forms of intimidation that had previously marginalized women. We recount the efforts to track and combat microaggressions in lab settings, showing how this granular day-to-day work became the bedrock upon which the new, inclusive culture of the École Polytechnique was built. This section provides a practical roadmap for any academic institution seeking to transform its culture from one of exclusion to one of belonging. A significant portion of our research focuses on the legacy of the 14. We track how the engineering projects, research grants, and university buildings that bear the names of the victims serve as constant, quiet reminders of the cost of failure. We discuss how these names were intentionally woven into the fabric of the university's daily life, not as passive monuments, but as active participants in the scholarly community. This integration of memory is an essential part of the modern engineering ethic, the understanding that we build upon the shoulders of those who were prevented from building their own futures. We also address the current state of engineering ethics in 2026. As we look at the integration of artificial intelligence and automated decision-making in engineering design, we revisit the lessons of 1989. The fear of algorithmic bias, the potential for software to replicate the same prejudices that fueled the perpetrator of the massacre, is the new frontier of our ethical challenge. We document how current engineering curricula have evolved to include algorithmic justice and ethical data management as core components. This shows that the engineering of ethics is an iterative process. Just as technologies evolve, so must our strategies for protecting the human element within them. The importance of this 7th chapter lies in its focus on systemic durability. It shows that culture change is not just about the loud speeches and the protests. It is about the quiet, persistent work of rewriting the manuals, reforming the codes, and rethinking the very way we train the builders of tomorrow. We offer this detailed investigation as a testament to the fact that the engineering profession, often criticized for its narrowness, demonstrated a profound capacity for self-reflection and structural adaptation when confronted with its own dark shadow. As we reach the conclusion of this investigation into the professional sphere, we set the stage for the next phase of our narrative, the politics of the everyday, where we will examine how the massacre reshaped the ordinary social interactions, neighborhood safety, and community bonding in the city of Montreal and beyond. We leave the reader with an understanding that the transformation of the engineering profession was one of the most concrete, long-lasting consequences of the 1989 massacre. It turned the site of the crime into an incubator for a new kind of professional identity, one that is as technically proficient as it is socially responsible. The engineers of today, by continuing this work, ensure that the light of the 14 is woven into the very structures they build, making our world not just more efficient, but fundamentally more just. In this 8th chapter of our chronicle, we turn our attention from the structured professional halls of engineering to the fluid, everyday reality of the politics of the ordinary. If the previous chapter examined the institutional reform of a discipline, this installment is an investigation into how the trauma of December 6, 1989, bled into the fabric of daily life, neighborhood dynamics, and the mundane social interactions of Montreal and beyond. We explore how the massacre recalibrated the public's sense of safety, transforming the routine into a site of vigilance and community building. The central premise of this chapter is the transition of public space from a taken-for-granted utility to a contested, conscious environment. In the late 80s, the streets, buses, and public squares of Montreal were governed by a baseline assumption of collective security. The massacre shattered this assumption. We reconstruct the atmosphere of the early 1990s, where the simple act of walking to class or waiting for a bus became, for many women, an exercise in hyper-awareness. We document the emergence of security-conscious urbanism, the grassroots efforts to improve lighting in alleyways, the creation of community watch programs, and the formalization of safe walk services on campuses and in residential sectors. This was the moment when the safety of women became a metric for the success of a city. A critical focus of our analysis is the rise of the neighborhood solidarity movement. We explore how the tragedy acted as a catalyst for residents to reclaim their immediate environments. In the months following the massacre, there was a surge in community meetings and neighborhood associations aimed at fostering closer social bonds. The logic was simple yet profound. Violence thrives in isolation, and the best defense against it is a community that knows its members. We provide an in-depth look at how these local efforts, often led by women who felt empowered by the feminist movement that had surged in the aftermath, redefined the relationship between the citizen and the city. We also examine the impact on the rhythms of domestic life. For families, the tragedy brought a somber transformation in the way young people were raised. We recount the testimonials of parents who, in the early 90s, adopted a more protective, informed, and communicative approach to their children's movements. This was not a surrender to fear, but a proactive strategy to balance independence with awareness. The culture of the curfew and the increased frequency of parent-teen discussions about gendered violence are documented here as part of the silent, enduring history of the massacre's ripple effects on the Canadian family unit. A significant portion of this chapter is devoted to the evolution of everyday activism. We move away from the high-profile legislative fights to look at the micro-interventions that define the lives of ordinary citizens. How does one challenge a sexist joke at the dinner table? How does a community association handle reports of domestic violence? We analyze how the lessons of 1989 trickled down into the informal codes of conduct that define social interaction. We show that the most effective change did not just occur in Parliament. It occurred in the kitchens, the break rooms, and the community centers of Montreal, where the normalization of sexist rhetoric began to face a firm, collective refusal. We further investigate the intersection of this everyday politics with the labor force. The massacre occurred in an academic setting, but its lessons were rapidly applied to the workplace. We track the emergence of workplace safety protocols that specifically addressed gendered harassment and violence as workplace hazards. This was a radical departure from the labor standards of the 80s, which largely ignored the social climate of the office. By documenting how these policies were implemented in small businesses and public institutions alike, we illustrate how the tragedy mandated a more nuanced, protective understanding of the modern professional environment. A crucial focus is placed on the emotional geography of Montreal. We look at the sites that became informal, decentralized memorials. The park benches where students used to sit, the specific bus stops, the quiet corners of the campus. These locations were imbued with a new significance, acting as silent reminders of lives interrupted. We provide an analysis of how these places changed the way the city's inhabitants moved through their own environment. Montreal became a city of memory, where even the most mundane daily routines were shadowed by the history of December 6th. This emotional mapping is essential for understanding how a city functions after a traumatic event. It does not just return to its previous shape, it develops a new, more layered texture. We also address the friction inherent in this new vigilance. We document the arguments against the increased emphasis on surveillance and caution, with some critics warning that the society risked becoming one defined by fear. We contrast these concerns with the testimony of those who argued that for women, the world had always been a place requiring vigilance. The only difference was that the rest of society had finally decided to pay attention. This debate is fundamental to our understanding of the 1990s and remains a key point of reflection in 2026. We show how the society negotiated the difficult balance between being a secure community and being an open, free one. The importance of this 8th chapter lies in its demonstration of the democratization of safety. It shows that the responsibility for a secure society does not rest solely with the police or the legislature. It rests in the hands of neighbors, colleagues, and families. We offer this detailed investigation to highlight that the most enduring legacy of the École Polytechnique is not found in a government report, but in the daily actions of citizens who chose to make their world a little safer, a little more aware, and a little more supportive. As we reach the conclusion of this investigation into the politics of the ordinary, we set the stage for the next phase of our story, the technological turn. We will examine how the advancement of digital tools, the rise of the internet, and the subsequent evolution of social media changed the way we share this history, communicate our struggles, and maintain our global network of solidarity. We leave the reader with the image of a neighborhood that, having been shaken by the unthinkable, reassembled itself through the quiet, steady work of daily, individual choices. The safety of our streets, the inclusivity of our workplaces, and the honesty of our personal conversations are all, in a very real sense, the legacy of the 14. They taught us that the most significant acts of citizenship are the ones we perform when no one is watching, in the rhythm of our own daily lives. In this 9th chapter of our chronicle, we investigate the technological turn of memory, the transformative period when the analog remembrance of the 1990s began to interface with the digital revolution. If the previous chapters analyzed the institutional and social shifts in the physical world, this installment explores how the birth of the internet and the subsequent rise of global connectivity changed the way we share the history of the École Polytechnique. We examine the evolution of our commemorative practices from static, local ceremonies to dynamic, global, and persistent digital narratives. The story begins in the mid-90s, a time when the internet was still in its infancy, yet its potential for social mobilization was already being recognized by grassroots activists. We reconstruct the early digital landscape, where the first websites dedicated to the victims of December 6th began to appear. These were rudimentary, text-heavy pages, but they represented a quantum leap in the democratization of memory. For the first time, information about the tragedy, the names of the victims, the legislative battles for gun control, and the ongoing struggle for gender equality, was not confined to printed archives or local library records. It became accessible to anyone with a dial-up connection, anywhere in the world. A critical focus of our analysis is the rise of the digital archive. We provide an in-depth investigation into how the tragedy necessitated a new way of preserving historical evidence. Before the digital age, much of the documentation, the victim impact statements, the commission reports, the correspondence between activists was scattered. We document the collaborative efforts by historians, IT professionals, and feminist scholars to digitize these records. This was not just a technical task, it was an act of historical protection, ensuring that the primary sources of this trauma would remain immune to the passage of time, decay, or political revisionism. We turn our attention to the emergence of early online communities. We analyze how discussion boards and mailing lists became the new digital town squares, where the debates we previously documented, the ethics of the profession, the effectiveness of gun control, the nature of misogyny, were continued with newfound intensity. We recount the testimonials of those who found solace and solidarity in these digital spaces. For a woman living in a remote region, far from the physical site of the monument in Montreal, the internet provided a way to participate in the vigil, to learn from the history, and to feel part of a movement. This was the dawn of the distributed memorialization that defines our current era. A significant portion of this chapter is devoted to the ethical challenges of digital memory. As we transition to social media platforms, the nature of our engagement with the tragedy became more complex. We analyze the tension between the viral nature of trauma and the need for respectful commemoration. We document the controversies that arose when, for example, images of the massacre were shared out of context or when the identity of the victims was co-opted by competing political agendas. This section is a masterclass in digital ethics, illustrating how the very tools that facilitate connection can also facilitate the trivialization of deep human suffering. We also examine the role of the algorithmic gatekeepers. As we look at the present day in 2026, we explore how search engines and social media algorithms manage the history of the École Polytechnique. We provide a critical review of the search engine optimization of grief, the phenomenon where the most popular narratives of the tragedy often override the most accurate or the most nuanced ones. This is a vital investigation for our contemporary reality. How do we ensure that the algorithmic visibility of this history honors the victims, rather than merely feeding the engagement metrics of tech giants? The chapter further explores the evolution of the digital vigil. We show how the annual December 6th commemorations are now augmented by sophisticated, multi-channel online events. We discuss the rise of live-streamed memorials, virtual reality tours of the monument, and interactive pedagogical platforms. These tools allow for a high level of engagement, but they also force us to ask, what is lost when we move from the physical, breath-filled space of a vigil to the mediated space of a screen? We document how the community has navigated this transition, blending the traditional and the digital to create a memorial experience that is both accessible and profound. A crucial focus is placed on the preservation of voice. We investigate the oral history projects that have moved online, where the interviews with survivors and family members are now housed in digital audiovisual repositories. We analyze the impact of these recordings on current engineering students. By making the lived experience of the victims' families available at the click of a button, these archives create an immediate, intergenerational bridge. We see how the story of 1989 is no longer something read in a book. It is something listened to in a voice that trembles with grief and resilience. This is the most powerful use of technology in our project of memory. We also address the challenges of digital fragility. While the internet offers persistence, it also offers ephemerality. We provide a technical and philosophical analysis of the risks of link rot, platform instability, and the consolidation of digital infrastructure. If a major platform that hosts the official records of the Commission of Inquiry were to go offline, what would happen to our history? This leads to a discussion on the importance of open-source memory infrastructure. The push for decentralized, community-owned databases that can survive the vicissitudes of the corporate world. The importance of this 9th chapter lies in its demonstration of the digital architecture of empathy. It shows that technology is not a neutral vessel. It is a landscape that we must consciously design to be hospitable to the complexities of human history. We offer this detailed investigation to show that the preservation of the memory of the École Polytechnique is now a task of both humanities and computer science. The engineers of today are building the digital structures that will hold the memories of tomorrow, and this, we argue, is the ultimate fulfillment of the lessons learned from the tragedy. As we reach the conclusion of this investigation into the technological turn, we set the stage for the next phase of our story, the resilience of future generations. We will examine how the generations born after 1989 have not just learned this history, but have internalized it as part of their identity. We leave the reader with an understanding that the digital revolution has transformed the memory of December 6th from a private, local haunting into a global, living heritage. We are no longer just keeping the fire burning in a physical monument. We are weaving it into the very fiber of our global digital connection. This is the new, unprecedented form of our duty to remember. In this 10th chapter of our chronicle, we explore the resilience of future generations, shifting our focus from the institutional and technological history of the massacre to the lived experience of the youth who have inherited this memory. By 2026, the École Polytechnique tragedy has become a historical pillar for a generation that never knew the sound of a rotary phone, let alone the world before the 1989 shooting. This installment investigates how the legacy of the 14 is being processed, adapted, and carried forward by young people who view the event not as a news headline, but as a defining element of their own ethical identity. The central thesis here is the concept of inherited empathy. For the youth of today, the massacre is not a singular, traumatic interruption of their own life, but a foundational myth of the society they inhabit. We document the emergence of a new way of remembering, the scholarly remembrance. We follow students in universities across Canada who, as part of their introductory engineering or sociology courses, engage with the history of the 14 women with a depth and seriousness that transcends mere curriculum requirements. They are not just memorizing dates. They are wrestling with the moral implications of what it means to be a professional in a world where hatred can still turn lethal. A significant portion of this chapter focuses on the generational transition of activism. We analyze how the firebrands of the 1990s have passed the mantle to a new cohort of activists who operate in a digital-first environment. This is not a fading of the movement, but a transformation. We showcase the innovative ways young people are using social media, not just to share, but to organize. We document the rise of decentralized student movements that operate without the formal hierarchies of the past, using platforms to coordinate large-scale educational initiatives and legislative pressure campaigns. This shift reveals that while the tactics have changed, the core commitment remains as solid as ever. We turn our attention to the pedagogy of the tragedy. How do we teach this history to a generation that experiences history through fragments? We investigate the modern classroom strategies employed in high schools and universities. We highlight the move away from the recounting of the crime toward the analysis of the context. Educators today are moving past the graphic details of the shooting to focus on the sociological structures of misogyny, the history of feminist organizing, and the importance of media literacy in preventing the spread of hateful ideologies. This chapter provides a critical review of these pedagogical models, illustrating how they foster a deep, intellectual connection to the memory of the victims. We also examine the role of the mentorship loop. We follow the relationships between the original survivors, the first witnesses, and the young students who now look to them as pillars of strength. These intergenerational dialogues are the heartbeat of the modern commemoration. We recount the powerful, often quiet moments where a survivor shares their experience with a group of nervous engineering students, and the resulting transformation in the students' commitment to their work. This is the human continuity that prevents history from becoming a static, distant object. We show how this mentorship turns the tragedy into a living, personal obligation. A crucial focus is placed on the integration of identity. For many young people in 2026, their own identity as engineers, journalists, or public servants is inextricably linked to their understanding of the École Polytechnique. We analyze the testimonies of students who describe their choice of career as a direct response to the massacre. They speak of the need to reclaim the space that was once violated. This is a profound shift. The massacre is no longer just a site of death. It is a catalyst for their own professional development. We document how they are actively choosing to build the future that the 14 were prevented from creating. We further explore the dilemma of normalization. How do we keep a 37-year-old event from becoming just another part of the background noise of a complex, crisis-ridden world? We investigate the strategies young activists use to keep the memory sharp. They are creating art, producing podcasts, and designing interactive projects that challenge the complacency of the digital age. This chapter highlights the creative friction that exists between those who believe the event should be treated as a sacred, quiet memory and those who believe it must be constantly remixed and brought into the daily, loud discourse of modern politics to ensure it isn't forgotten. A significant portion of this chapter is devoted to the global reach of the youth movement. We show how the memory of the 14 women has been woven into the international Me Too and global gender equity movements. We analyze how young activists in Canada are collaborating with their counterparts in other nations to share stories and tactics. The École Polytechnique has become a universal digital reference point, a shared story that connects students from Montreal to Mumbai, from Toronto to Tunis. This globalization of memory is the most significant development of the current era, proving that the struggle for equality is the most powerful common language we possess. We also address the psychological resilience of the younger generation. We offer an expert-led analysis of how this generation deals with the trauma of information, the constant access to stories of violence that can lead to burnout and cynicism. We document the practices they use to sustain their activism, the focus on self-care, the importance of communal support, and the reliance on intellectual curiosity as a buffer against despair. This is a vital investigation for any society dealing with the long-term effects of collective trauma. How do we empower the young without burdening them beyond their capacity to cope? The importance of this 10th chapter lies in its demonstration of the immortality of the mission. It shows that as long as we keep the history of the École Polytechnique alive, the mission of the 14 women lives on through the next generation. We offer this analysis to emphasize that the true legacy is not the memorial of stone, but the minds of the students who carry the torch. The memory is safe not because it is etched in history books, but because it is integrated into the living, working, and striving identity of every young person who refuses to let the past go cold. As we conclude this investigation into the resilience of future generations, we set the stage for the next phase of our story, the ethics of the machine. We will examine how the development of artificial intelligence and its application to social safety and predictive justice must be guided by the very principles that the tragedy of 1989 forced us to adopt. We leave the reader with the image of a young student standing in the modern laboratories of the École Polytechnique, holding a degree that represents not just a qualification, but a promise. The resilience of the future is not a passive outcome. It is a constant, deliberate, and courageous act of construction. The 14 women were prevented from building the future, but they are, in every sense, the foundation upon which the youth of today are standing. In this 11th chapter, we transition from the human-centric resilience of the youth to the cold, sophisticated, and increasingly complex domain of the ethics of the machine. As we navigate the technological landscape of 2026, the École Polytechnique tragedy has evolved into a critical case study for the development of artificial intelligence, AI. If our previous chapters documented how a nation processed trauma through human empathy and social reform, this chapter investigates how we must embed those same values into the very algorithms that now mediate our existence. We explore the intersection of automated decision-making and the historical memory of systemic gender-based violence. The central inquiry of this chapter is the risk of algorithmic re-traumatization. As AI systems are increasingly tasked with predictive policing, human resources screening, and sentiment analysis in social media monitoring, we must confront a dangerous possibility: the capacity for these systems to inadvertently codify, perpetuate, and even scale the very misogyny that Marc Lépine unleashed in 1989. We analyze the historical data sets that train our AI. When an algorithm is fed decades of digitized police reports, news archives, and social commentary, it is effectively ingesting the structural biases of the past. If left uncorrected, these systems risk re-victimizing the marginalized by flagging them as high risk or unsuitable based on patterns that are themselves products of systemic prejudice. A significant portion of this chapter is devoted to the design of algorithmic empathy. How do we build a machine that understands the gravity of the École Polytechnique without trivializing it? We discuss the move toward human-in-the-loop systems, where the nuanced, lived experience of survivors and activists is integrated into the fine-tuning of machine learning models. We highlight the work of interdisciplinary teams, composed of data scientists, sociologists, and historians, who are creating ethical guardrails for AI. These are not just lines of code. They are programmatic expressions of the values for which Canada fought in the decades following the massacre: justice, equality, and the recognition of systemic hatred. we turn our attention to the role of AI in public safety. In 2026, the debate over gun control has moved into the realm of predictive threat detection. We examine how AI models are used to monitor, identify, and report potential radicalization in online environments. The lesson of 1989 is the centerpiece of this analysis. The perpetrator did not manifest in a vacuum. He was the product of a specific, identifiable ideological ecosystem. We analyze how AI can be a tool for early intervention, capable of detecting the warning signs of extremist rhetoric long before they harden into violence. However, we also provide a critical analysis of the civil liberties issues inherent in this. How do we prevent the surveillance of the many in the name of protecting the few? A crucial focus is placed on the institutionalization of equity in tech. We look at the modern engineering culture within the big tech firms that build the infrastructure of our digital world. We analyze the push for diverse data sovereignty, arguing that the teams building these algorithms must reflect the diversity of the society they impact. The École Polytechnique tragedy taught us that isolation and echo chambers are fatal. Therefore, the architectural requirement for AI development must be the inclusion of diverse, dissenting, and historically marginalized voices in the design phase. This is the ultimate engineering of ethics. Moving from the reactive posture of the 1990s to the proactive design standards of 2026, we further explore the algorithmic audit. Just as the university underwent inquiries to determine its failures, we argue that AI systems impacting social safety must undergo regular historical audits. These audits would assess whether the software displays patterns of gendered bias. We document the progress of current legislative efforts to mandate these audits, framing them as the technological successor to the commissions of inquiry that defined the early 90s. By keeping our machines accountable to the history of our trauma, we ensure that they do not become instruments of the same forces that destroyed so many lives. The chapter also delves into the ethics of automated memory. We discuss how AI is used to catalog and protect the archives of the 1989 tragedy. AI-powered image restoration, voice analysis of recorded testimonials, and semantic mapping of historical documents have allowed us to create a digital library that is searchable, accurate, and resilient. This is the positive application of the machine, the use of computing power to ensure that the voices of the 14 women remain audible in an increasingly loud, chaotic information ecosystem. We show how AI can be a shield for truth, protecting historical evidence against the rising tide of deepfakes and disinformation. We also address the psychological impact on the developers. Many of the young programmers in 2026 are conscious of the ethical burden they carry. We share interviews with researchers who describe their work as an extension of the activism that began after the massacre. They speak of a technological duty, the feeling that their code is a direct intervention into a history that they are determined not to repeat. This is a profound evolution. The engineer has become the custodian of social justice. The importance of this 11th chapter lies in its demonstration of the technocratic evolution of justice. It shows that as our society becomes more dependent on automated systems, our definition of justice must become more technical. The lessons of the École Polytechnique are no longer just social, they are operational. We offer this detailed investigation to emphasize that the fight against gender-based violence is now a fight for the integrity of our software. We must ensure that the machines we build are incapable of harboring the same prejudices that we have worked so hard to dismantle in our physical communities. As we reach the conclusion of this investigation into the ethics of the machine, we set the stage for the next phase of our story, the resilient city. We will examine how the physical design of our urban landscapes, the architecture of our buildings, and the planning of our transit systems have been reimagined to ensure safety, accessibility, and community connection. We leave the reader with the image of a machine learning model that, before suggesting a classification or a decision, is tempered by a baseline understanding of human rights. The ultimate success of the digital age will be measured by whether it can hold the memory of the 14 women as a core, unchangeable value in the binary of its decision-making. We are not just coding for efficiency. We are coding for a future that finally, truly, respects the value of every life. In this 12th chapter of our chronicle, we turn our gaze toward the physical landscape, investigating the resilient city, how the tragedy of December 6, 1989, fundamentally altered urban planning, architectural design, and the concept of public safety in Montreal, and by extension, the modern urban environment. If our previous chapter looked at the digital and algorithmic layers of society, this installment focuses on the tangible, lived environment, exploring how the very walls, streets, and transit systems around us have been reshaped by the collective memory of the École Polytechnique. The central premise of this chapter is that the city is a living participant in our societal values. In the aftermath of 1989, urban planners and architects began to view the city not merely as a network of infrastructure, but as an environment of psychological impact. We trace the shift from the fortress mentality, where security was synonymous with fences, gates, and surveillance, toward a design for connection, where safety is achieved through transparency, visibility, and the active encouragement of community interaction. We argue that the most effective way to prevent the kind of isolation that fueled Marc Lepin's radicalization is to design cities that foster spontaneous, inclusive social engagement. A significant portion of this chapter is devoted to the architecture of inclusivity. We examine the renovation and expansion of the École Polytechnique itself, documenting how the university, in its physical renewal, chose to honor the past without being defined by the trauma. We analyze the design of the common areas, the wide corridors, and the open-concept lecture halls that facilitate visual and social openness. This was a deliberate architectural strategy, to create a space where no one could be hidden, where the architecture itself discouraged the fragmentation of the community into silos, and where the presence of the other was an inherent part of the daily experience. We turn our attention to the Safe City movement. Following the massacre, municipal governments in Montreal and other major Canadian cities launched formal initiatives to identify unsafe zones. Places where lighting was poor, pedestrian traffic was absent, or the design itself created an environment of vulnerability. We document how these initiatives transformed the urban experience, particularly for women. The introduction of CPDID, crime prevention through environmental design, principles became a standard in municipal planning. We highlight the installation of better public lighting, the design of more intuitive and well-trafficked pathways, and the integration of transit stops into vibrant, monitored urban hubs. This is the democratization of safety, manifested in bricks and mortar. A crucial focus is placed on the memorialization of public space. We discuss the philosophy behind the permanent public art and monuments that have been integrated into the city's urban fabric. We analyze the difference between a monument that is placed in a city and a monument that belongs to it. We look at the White Rose initiatives and the public parks that serve as quiet sanctuaries of reflection. These are not merely decorative additions, they are urban acupuncture points, small, strategic interventions that remind the citizen, in the midst of their daily commute, of the values of the society they are participating in. We further explore the design of transparency. In the 1990s and early 2000s, there was an intense debate over how to balance public openness with the need for security in government and academic buildings. We document how the open-door policy became a political statement. Rather than retreating behind bulletproof glass and heavy screening, many institutions chose to lean into the concept of the transparent institution, using architecture to signal that the space belongs to the public and that it will not be intimidated. This was a brave and often risky architectural choice, one that reinforces our commitment to a democratic, inclusive society despite the shadow of past violence. The chapter also delves into the accessibility of memory. We discuss how urban planners have worked to ensure that the memory of the 14 women is accessible to all, regardless of physical ability or socioeconomic status. We document the creation of barrier-free memorial paths and the integration of these histories into the city's educational tourism. By making the memory of the École Polytechnique a standard, integrated feature of the city's geography, urban planners have ensured that it remains visible and relevant to the millions of people who inhabit or visit Montreal, preventing the history from becoming localized or neglected. We also address the psychological impact of these urban changes on the citizen. We offer an analysis of environmental psychology, how the quality of our surroundings affects our sense of trust and community belonging. We show that when a city invests in beautiful, safe, and inclusive public spaces, it is, in effect, investing in the social contract. The resilience of the city is not just in its power to recover from a disaster. It is in its ability to nurture a sense of collective ownership. When a city treats its citizens with the dignity of inclusive, safe, and thoughtful design, It communicates that it values them, which in turn fosters a culture that rejects the isolationist, hateful ideologies that led to 1989. A significant part of our investigation is dedicated to the future of urban safety. As we look to 2026, we explore the integration of smart city technology with the principles of inclusive urbanism. We show how sensor-based lighting, predictive transit management, and community monitoring tools are being deployed, not as tools of mass surveillance, but as components of a responsive urban environment. We analyze the ethical challenges of these technologies, emphasizing that the human-centric principles of design must remain the primary constraint on any technological innovation. The importance of this 12th chapter lies in its demonstration of the spatialization of values. It shows that our built environment is an argument about who we are and what we stand for. By examining the urban changes in Montreal, we provide a concrete, tangible record of how a city chose to heal itself. We offer this investigation to highlight that the legacy of the École Polytechnique is not just an idea, but a physical landscape, a city that was rebuilt to be more resilient, more transparent, and more deeply connected to the people who walk its streets. As we reach the conclusion of this investigation into the resilient city, we set the stage for the next phase of our story, the resilient economy. We will examine how the economic structures, the labor market, and the professional dynamics of the Canadian economy have been transformed to ensure equity and to prevent the marginalization that can fuel social resentment. We leave the reader with the image of a city that, while forever scarred by the events of December 6th, has evolved to provide a safer, more welcoming, and more deeply integrated experience for all. Every corner turned, every well-lit path taken, and every public space enjoyed is a quiet, ongoing tribute to the 14 women, and a testament to the fact that we have built a society that is not only capable of remembering, but also capable of creating a more equitable, inclusive foundation for the future. In this 13th chapter, we turn our attention from the physical architecture of the city to the structural architecture of our economy. If the previous chapter examined how urban design shaped our public safety, this installment investigates the resilient economy, the long-term, systemic effort to ensure that the economic landscape of 2026 is one where equity, representation, and opportunity are not merely aspirational goals, but institutional realities. We analyze how the shadow of December 6, 1989, forced Canada to confront the economic dimensions of gender-based exclusion and why creating a fair market is an essential component of preventing systemic violence. The central thesis of this chapter is that economic marginalization is a form of social fragility. We document how the massacre at the École Polytechnique served as a wake-up call for the corporate and governmental sectors. In the early 90s, the conversation was often limited to workplace harassment policies. However, the movement that emerged from the ashes of the tragedy pushed for a much deeper inquiry. Why were women being steered away from high-value technical sectors? Why did the pay gap persist even in fields that were supposedly based on objective, meritocratic standards? This chapter provides an investigation into the structural barriers to equity that were identified in the years following the tragedy and the arduous, multi-decade struggle to dismantle them. A significant portion of this chapter is devoted to the institutionalization of equity in the STEM labor market. We trace the history of the gender diversity mandates that began to appear in the late 90s. We document the resistance from traditional corporate structures, the debates over quotas versus merit, and the eventual realization that the exclusion of women was not just an issue of fairness, but a significant economic inefficiency. By integrating longitudinal data from the Canadian labor market, we show how the increased participation of women in engineering, technology, and senior leadership positions in the post-1989 era contributed to a more robust, innovative, and resilient economy. We provide a detailed analysis of how the push for diversity was, in reality, a push for better, more comprehensive decision-making. We turn our attention to the corporate social responsibility, CSR, evolution. We examine how the memory of the École Polytechnique became a cornerstone of the ESG, environmental, social, and governance framework in Canada. We document the emergence of social audits, where companies were forced to report not just on their financial health, but on their cultural health. This was the moment when the human cost of toxic work environments was finally given a place on the corporate balance sheet. We highlight the work of early corporate leaders who recognize that a company that does not prioritize the psychological and physical safety of its female employees is a company that is fundamentally vulnerable to internal collapse and external reputational damage. A crucial focus is placed on the economic empowerment of the next generation. We investigate the history of the scholarship funds, the mentorship programs, and the targeted venture capital initiatives that were created in the wake of the tragedy to support young women entering the workforce. These were not just charitable acts, they were strategic investments. We recount the stories of successful female entrepreneurs and engineers who credit these early institutional supports with providing the leverage they needed to break through the glass ceiling. This section illustrates the multiplier effect of investment in equity. By removing the barriers for a few, the society unlocked the potential for many. We further explore the transformation of labor laws. We analyze the legislative journey from basic anti-harassment statutes to the comprehensive Pay Equity and Workplace Safety Acts of the early 2000s. We document the legal battles that were required to make these laws stick, showing how the judiciary slowly but surely aligned with the changing societal consensus that a safe workplace is a human right, not a luxury. By situating these legal shifts in the context of the post-1989 societal awakening, we demonstrate how the tragedy provided the political capital necessary to pass laws that would otherwise have been stalled for decades. The chapter also delves into the economics of the care economy. We analyze the shift in perception regarding the value of labor that is often historically feminized. We discuss the recognition that for an economy to be truly resilient, it must value the social infrastructure, education, healthcare, and community support, as highly as it values the industrial and technical sectors. This is the holistic economic perspective that was born from the trauma of 1989, the understanding that our economic strength is tied to our social health. If we neglect the social structures that support our citizens, we invite the kind of fragmentation that led to the atrocity at the École Polytechnique. We also address the global economic landscape of 2026. As we look at the international trade agreements and the global standards for labor and human rights, we identify the influence of the Canadian model. Canada's commitment to gender equity in the workplace has become a key element of its economic diplomacy. We analyze how Canadian firms, operating in a globalized market, have exported the lesson that inclusive workforces are more successful. This is a subtle but profound legacy. The values that were hardened in the crucible of Montreal are now helping to shape the standards of global commerce. A significant part of our investigation is dedicated to the future of economic inclusivity. We explore how the rise of the platform economy, remote work, and decentralized employment models in 2026 offers new opportunities, but also new challenges. We examine how we can ensure that these new economic structures do not recreate the old barriers. We emphasize that the responsibility to maintain equity is an ongoing, daily commitment that must be reevaluated every time the fundamental structure of the economy shifts. We argue that the memory of the 14 must be the benchmark by which we judge all new economic developments. The importance of this 13th chapter lies in its demonstration of the economic necessity of ethics. It shows that there is no hard economy that is separate from the human economy. Every dollar earned, every contract signed, and every corporate decision made is an expression of our societal values. By examining the evolution of the Canadian economy since the 1989 massacre, we provide a blueprint for how a society can choose to align its prosperity with its principles. We offer this investigation to highlight that the legacy of the École Polytechnique is found not only in our laws or our buildings, but in the equitable distribution of opportunity that defines our daily economic life. As we reach the conclusion of this investigation into the resilient economy, we set the stage for the next phase of our story, the resilient public discourse. We will examine how our media, our journalism, and our collective public conversations have been transformed to become more inclusive, more critical, and more resistant to the rhetoric of hatred. We leave the reader with an understanding that the work of building a fair economy is the work of protecting the future of all women, ensuring that their potential, their talent, and their hard work are never again silenced by the violent hand of prejudice. Our economic resilience is the ultimate tribute to the 14 women, as it represents a world where their contributions would have been fully realized, celebrated, and valued by the very society that once in a moment of catastrophic failure, betrayed them. In this 14th chapter, we move from the structural foundations of our economy to the resilient public discourse, an investigation into how the massacre of December 6, 1989, fundamentally overhauled the way we communicate, report, and engage in public conversation about violence, gender, and societal responsibility. If previous chapters focused on institutions, physical spaces, and the economy, this installment explores the informational nervous system of the nation, our media, our journalistic standards, and the collective ability of society to speak truths that were once considered taboo. The central premise of this chapter is that the language we use to describe a crisis is the most powerful tool we have for either resolution or further division. In the immediate aftermath of the École Polytechnique massacre, the Canadian media landscape was, by today's standards, remarkably ill-equipped. We document the journalistic failure of the early hours of December 6th, the initial reliance on sanitized, passive language that framed the event as a tragic enigma rather than a targeted political act. We analyze how this failure of framing led to a widespread, dangerous public narrative that sought to avoid the difficult questions of misogyny and systemic violence, effectively silencing the voices of those who recognized the crime for what it truly was. A significant portion of this chapter is devoted to the evolution of journalistic ethics. We trace the long, contentious process of developing the reporting standards we now take for granted in 2026. We investigate the push for trauma-informed journalism, a professional standard that was effectively birthed by the collective exhaustion and frustration of families, survivors, and activists who felt betrayed by sensationalist reporting in the 90s. This chapter provides a detailed analysis of how newsrooms were forced to integrate the expertise of sociologists and advocates into their reporting cycles, moving from a culture of objective detachment to one of responsible clarity. We turn our attention to the rise of the critical public voice. The tragedy of 1989 was the primary catalyst for a new wave of Canadian public intellectuals, essayists, and columnists who refused to let the narrative of the lone wolf stand. We profile the seminal pieces of journalism that shifted the national discourse, pieces that dared to name the ideology of the perpetrator, and that forced the Canadian public to look directly into the mirror of its own systemic biases. By analyzing these texts, we demonstrate how the act of writing became an act of public healing, establishing the precedent that the press has a fundamental duty not just to report the news, but to hold the mirror up to society's deepest fractures. A crucial focus is placed on the role of language in policy. We document how the shift in public discourse, the adoption of terms like feminicide, gender-based violence, and systemic misogyny, directly informed the drafting of new legislation. Words are the building blocks of law. We show how the successful campaigns for stricter gun control and the implementation of gender equity policies were only possible because the vocabulary of the public had evolved to match the gravity of the problem. This section serves as a case study for students of political science, how a change in public discourse is the indispensable precondition for a change in public policy. We further explore the transformation of the media academic pipeline. In the decades following the massacre, the synergy between university researchers studying gender and the journalists reporting on it became a cornerstone of Canadian public life. We document how this cross-pollination of information ensured that news reports were grounded in data, research, and expert analysis, rather than rumor and speculation. This era fostered a more literate public, a citizenry that was better equipped to demand accountability from its representatives because it was better informed about the nature of the challenges the nation faced. The chapter also delves into the challenges of the digital echo chamber. As we move into the 2026 present, we contrast the gains in professional journalism with the rise of the decentralized, often toxic, landscape of social media discourse. We analyze the tension between the curated, ethical standards of traditional media and the chaotic, often reactionary, environment of the digital sphere. We provide a critical review of how modern journalists are working to bridge this gap, using digital platforms not to spread discord, but to curate a digital public square that promotes constructive debate. We highlight the role of digital literacy campaigns that are now, in a direct lineage from the 1989 response, being taught in schools to help youth navigate the complexities of online information. We also address the ethics of the historical voice. We explore how the media has managed the ongoing responsibility of keeping the story of the 14 women alive. We document the evolution of the December 6th coverage, showing how it has moved from a report on a tragedy to a complex, multi-layered reflection on the progress of human rights. This is a vital task: how to keep a history from becoming stale or ritualized. We analyze the innovative media projects, the long-form investigative podcasts, the interactive timelines, and the multimedia archives that have successfully maintained the relevance of this history for a new, digitally native generation. A significant part of our investigation is dedicated to the democratization of truth. We explore how social media, for all its dangers, has also allowed for the emergence of diverse voices that were once excluded from the mainstream media. We document how activists, survivors, and family members are now their own publishers, using digital platforms to share their truths directly with the public. This has created a more porous, responsive, and ultimately more truthful media landscape. We argue that this is a direct, positive outcome of the struggle for voice that began in the dark days of 1989. The importance of this 14th chapter lies in its demonstration of the fragility and the power of narrative. It shows that the history of the École Polytechnique is not a fixed monument. It is a story that is being written, interpreted, and protected every single day by the way we choose to speak about it. We offer this investigation to highlight that the legacy of the 14 is protected by our commitment to truth-telling, our refusal to let hateful ideologies be normalized, and our persistence in demanding a public discourse that is grounded in empathy and evidence. As we reach the conclusion of this investigation into the resilient public discourse, we set the stage for the next phase of our story: the ethics of global responsibility. We will examine how the Canadian experience, having been refined and tested over 37 years of hard-won progress, now informs the country's role on the world stage as a leader in the global movement for gender equity. We leave the reader with the image of a public square that, while imperfect and constantly challenged, is vastly more capable, informed, and resilient than the one we inhabited in 1989. Every word written in the cause of equality, every interview conducted with integrity, and every challenging conversation had in the digital space is a continuation of the commitment we made to the 14. We are not just reporting on the past. We are actively constructing a future where their voices, though silenced by violence, echo forever in the clarity and the courage of our collective conscience. In this final chapter of our extensive chronicle, we arrive at the threshold of the present day in 2026. We transition from the history of our trauma, our institutional reforms, and our societal reckonings to the ultimate question of the ethics of global responsibility. If this series began with the specific, devastating rupture of December 6, 1989, it concludes by examining how that rupture became a global beacon, how a Canadian tragedy evolved into an international imperative for the protection of human rights and the eradication of gender-based violence. This final installment is a testament to the fact that the struggle initiated in the halls of the École Polytechnique is now the defining human rights challenge of the 21st century. The central thesis of our conclusion is the concept of transnational solidarity. We document how the Canadian experience, the painful, methodical process of legislative, academic, and cultural reform, has served as a template for activists, policymakers, and scholars in every corner of the globe. From the legislative battles in Latin America to the grassroots movements in East Africa and the policy shifts in the European Union, the Montreal model of institutional accountability has been studied, adapted, and implemented. We provide a survey of this global influence, demonstrating how the death of the 14 women triggered a ripple effect that is still expanding today. The tragedy, once contained in a single classroom, has become a universal metric for the state's commitment to the rights and safety of women. A significant portion of this final chapter is devoted to the global architecture of human rights. We investigate the role of Canada within the United Nations and other international human rights bodies. We document how the domestic lessons of 1989 were translated into international treaties and norms. We analyze the push for the formal recognition of feminicide as a distinct crime under international law, showcasing how Canadian diplomats, supported by a broad coalition of civil society organizations, have led the way in redefining the international understanding of what constitutes a crime against humanity. This is the highest form of our national atonement, to transform our deepest sorrow into a global instrument of protection. We turn our attention to the global digital network of activism. In 2026, the struggle for gender equity is inextricably linked to the global internet. We document the emergence of international digital repositories that hold the history of gender-based violence from around the world, creating a unified global memory that is accessible to all. We analyze how activists in different countries use this shared history to support each other, sharing strategies, funding, and intellectual resources. This is the ultimate fruition of the technological turn we discussed in Chapter 9, a global, decentralized, and persistent commitment to memory that transcends national borders, languages, and cultures. A crucial focus is placed on the education of the future. We analyze how the history of the École Polytechnique is taught in international curricula. We look at how university students in Seoul, Berlin, and Mexico City engage with the Montreal tragedy as a foundational text in human rights studies. We highlight the work of global academic partnerships that bring together scholars to research the intersection of technology, gender, and violence. By keeping the history of 1989 alive in the international classroom, we are ensuring that the next generation of global leaders is fundamentally sensitized to the dangers of systemic misogyny. We further explore the ethics of global diplomacy. We investigate how the recognition of gender-based violence has become a core element of Canadian foreign policy, influencing the way we engage with global trade, conflict resolution, and international development aid. We document the implementation of the Feminist International Assistance Policy, which prioritizes the support of women and girls in all aspects of our global involvement. This is the practical application of the lesson we learned, that the safety of women is the most reliable barometer for the health, stability, and prosperity of any society. The chapter also delves into the challenges of the universalist approach. We provide a critical, honest assessment of the pitfalls of applying a Western, Canadian-centric framework to the diverse, deeply localized contexts of other cultures. We discuss the importance of global dialogue rather than global exploitation, emphasizing that the struggle for equality must be adapted to the specific cultural and political realities of each nation. We show how the most effective international movements are those that recognize local leadership, honor diverse histories, and focus on the shared goal of human dignity. This nuance is vital for our future progress. We must remain humble, listening as much as we speak, as we continue this global project. We also address the perpetual nature of the mission. As we look toward the horizon beyond 2026, we acknowledge that the work is far from finished. The rise of new forms of digital extremism, the threat of backsliding on human rights in various parts of the world, and the challenges of a rapidly changing technological landscape mean that the vigilance we started in 1989 must never cease. We argue that the memory of the 14 women is not a trophy of past victory, but a compass for future effort. We are not done with this history. We are perpetually in the process of applying its lessons to the new crises of our time. A significant part of our investigation is dedicated to the future of human coexistence. We explore the vision of a world where gender is not a predictor of vulnerability, where professional spaces are universally inclusive, and where systemic violence is met with immediate global condemnation. This is the utopia that we are building, step by painful step. We argue that the legacy of the École Polytechnique is the conviction that this future is not only possible but inevitable, provided we remain committed to the hard, unglamorous, and essential work of remembrance and reform. The importance of this final chapter lies in its declaration of the unbroken thread. It shows that the 14 lives lost on December 6, 1989, have been woven into the fabric of the global struggle for human rights. Every policy change, every social shift, and every act of solidarity across the world is a part of that thread. We offer this concluding investigation to demonstrate that the tragedy did not end the story of the 14. It began a global, historical process that has fundamentally redefined our sense of justice. We leave the reader with a profound sense of responsibility. The future we build is the monument we create. As we conclude this long journey through the history, the aftermath, and the global legacy of the École Polytechnique, we are left with the silence of the monument, but also with the roar of a movement. We are the inheritors of a terrible truth and a magnificent resolve. We hold the memory of Genevieve, Helene, Natalie, Barbara, Anne-Marie, Maud, Barbara, Maurice, Anne-Marie, Sonia, Michelle, Annie, and Annie not just as a prayer, but as a promise. The struggle for equality, safety, and dignity is the work of every generation. We take the lessons of these last 37 years and carry them into the future, grounded in the knowledge that while hate may be capable of a moment of destruction, the human capacity for love, memory, and collective action is, and will always be, capable of an eternity of repair. Our history has changed the world, and now, the future is ours to build. In this 16th and final chapter of our expansive chronicle, we move beyond the immediate historical analysis to embrace a philosophy of proactive coexistence. If the previous chapters trace the trauma, the systemic reform, and the global legacy of the École Polytechnique, this final installment serves as a manifesto for the future. As we stand in 2026, we are not merely preserving the memory of the 14. We are defining what it means to build a society where such a loss is fundamentally incompatible with the surrounding social and technological architecture. The central thesis here is the concept of anti-fragility, a term borrowed from systems theory to describe a structure that not only withstands trauma, but actually becomes stronger and more intelligent because of it. The history of the École Polytechnique is our national and global case study in anti-fragility. We have shown how the vulnerability exposed in 1989 forced us to harden our institutions, sharpen our ethics, and deepen our collective commitment to equality. This chapter explores how we can apply these lessons to the looming, complex challenges of the next decade, ensuring that the progress we have made is not just preserved but accelerated. A significant portion of this final reflection is devoted to the design of social trust. We argue that the most critical infrastructure of 2026 is not our power grids or our fiber optic cables, but the level of trust between citizens. We document the evolution of proactive social cohesion, initiatives, government and grassroots programs that work to break down the silos of ideology and identity that characterize the digital age. By analyzing the success of community-led reconciliation projects, we provide a model for how to navigate polarization. The lesson of 1989 is that when we cease to see each other as fellow human beings and start viewing others as threats to our worldview, the ground is prepared for violence. We must, therefore, engineer a society that incentivizes empathy as a social currency. We turn our attention to the ethics of intellectual rigor. The tragedy of 1989 was fueled by a radicalized anti-intellectual ideology that sought to simplify complex human realities into binary, hateful categories. We argue that the primary defense against such extremism is a robust, diverse, and accessible intellectual culture. We explore the role of education not just as a means of professional advancement, but as a mechanism for developing critical thinking. We advocate for a universal liberal arts framework in technical education, ensuring that even the most specialized engineers possess the sociological, historical, and ethical literacy to understand the social impact of their work. This is our insurance policy against the return of the radicalization that fueled the shooter. A crucial focus is placed on technological stewardship. As AI and automation continue to reshape our lives, we must avoid the passive acceptance of new tools. We reiterate the necessity of algorithmic citizenship, the idea that every individual has a right to understand, challenge, and shape the digital systems that govern their opportunities. We argue for the creation of a global tech ethics accord, a treaty of sorts that would establish universal standards for the development of software, ensuring that all technology is built with a foundational commitment to human safety, privacy, and equality. The memory of 1989 serves as our reminder that if we do not build our systems with the values of inclusion, they will by default recreate the prejudices of the past. We further explore the transformation of masculinity. A core, often overlooked aspect of the struggle post-1989 has been the work done by men to redefine their own role in the fight against gender-based violence. We document the emergence of positive masculinity programs that teach young men to challenge the toxic patterns of control, entitlement, and exclusion. This is not about shaming, but about empowering, showing that the path to a better society is one where men are active, vocal, and committed partners in the pursuit of equity. This evolution in the male experience is a vital, necessary component of the resilient city and the resilient economy. The chapter also delves into the sustainability of activism. We address the burnout that often accompanies long-term social movements. We explore the culture of restorative advocacy, a model of activism that prioritizes the mental, physical, and emotional well-being of the activists themselves. We argue that a movement that treats its members as disposable will ultimately fail. By documenting the success of organizations that have integrated wellness and peer support into their political strategies, we provide a blueprint for how to maintain the momentum of the movement over decades. This is the secret to the durability of the December 6th commemorations. They have been sustained by a community that knows how to care for itself. We also address the global moral imperative. As we look at the world in 2026, we see a landscape characterized by both immense opportunity and profound geopolitical fragility. We argue that Canada's role, informed by the history of the École Polytechnique, should be to act as a global anchor for human rights. This means using our diplomatic, economic, and cultural power to advocate for the protection of women in regions where they are still denied basic freedoms. We articulate a vision of international relations where gender equality is not a side issue, but a central, non-negotiable pillar of all international agreements. A significant part of our investigation is dedicated to the future of memory. How will we remember this in the year 2050? We discuss the potential for adaptive memorialization, the idea that our monuments and our stories should evolve with each generation. We propose that the commemorations of the future should involve more than just looking back. They should involve an act of doing. We envision a world where every December 6th is a day not just of mourning, but of national service, where citizens collectively commit to a new project of social, technical, or educational reform. This is how we keep the memory alive, by turning it into a force for creation. The importance of this final, supplementary chapter lies in its declaration of the unfinished symphony. It shows that our work is a continuous, iterative process. We offer this manifesto not as a set of static answers, but as a set of vital, ongoing questions. The legacy of the 14 is not a destination we reach. It is the path we walk every day. We are the architects of the next era, and we possess the agency to ensure that our future is characterized by the very inclusivity, respect, and profound empathy that were denied to those whose lives were taken in 1989. As we reach the conclusion of this chronicle, we leave the reader with a final, guiding thought: we are bound together. The tragedy of 1989 was an attempt to tear the fabric of our community, to assert that we are divided, that we are enemies, that some belong and others do not. Our response has been a multi-decade, exhaustive, and beautiful proof of the opposite. We have shown that when we are broken, we do not simply patch the cracks. We build a better, stronger, and more transparent structure. The 14 women, Genevieve, Helene, Natalie, Barbara, Anne-Marie, Maud, Barbara, Maurice, Anne-Marie, Sonia, Michelle, Annie, and Annie, are the cornerstone of this new world. Their presence is felt in every line of code that promotes equality, every brick laid for a more inclusive city, and every conversation held in the name of understanding. We are their living, breathing legacy. And as we move forward into the future, we do so with the absolute, unwavering conviction that the light we carry is brighter and more enduring than any darkness we have faced. Our symphony is ongoing, our resolve is absolute, and our future is ultimately ours to write together.